Looks good. Okay, so I think we are good to go, and we're only 3 minutes late. So that's a good start, and we'll try to stay on time throughout the rest of the conference. We'll do our best. There are breaks built in throughout the whole, so there's some cushion time-wise. Okay, so welcome everyone to the conference on the philosophy of mythology and the Continental tradition. Today is the first day of 3 days, all of which will be live streamed via YouTube. And the talks will remain, or at least many of the talks will be online for others to view afterwards. For those of you watching via YouTube, you can ask questions in the chat box there or in the comments section. We have somebody who's looking at that and then can relay questions to the speaker. Welcome again to all the participants from all over the world. I would have preferred to have welcomed you in person, but due to quarantine regulations still in place here in Hong Kong, we are compelled to organize everything online. And I know that due to time differences, not everyone can attend all the talks, although as we see, Brian Smith is already with us in the early mornings here, so a special shout out to him for getting up and being here at 4 a.m. But hopefully there are enough talks that everyone can attend something, despite the time differences. I'd like to thank a few people for their help with this. First, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, obviously, for helping to organize, especially Jasmine Chan, who is with us right now for helping with organization, facilitation. Also, the Hong Kong Research Grants Council, who originally sponsored not only my grant, but also the provided funding, much of which obviously we don't need anymore because it's online. And also I want to thank the student helpers who are helping out over the 3 days to make sure things run smoothly and we don't have any significant technical problems and help keep everybody on track. A special thank you to the keynote speakers who are giving us keynote talks. Chef Nicholas, who's with us here, he's going to talk about Star Wars, or Kassir Star Wars, and the aesthetic transformation of mythical consciousness. So I'm looking forward to that. Marcus Gabriel is also one of the other keynotes, and he's going to talk about mythology and ideology. And thank you, of course, to all the other contributors for putting the work in to give talks. And also, hopefully, at the end of the whole process, we'll have a book to publish together. We're looking to do it with Moore and Ziebeck, so people who are watching can look out for this. Okay, so I'll try to keep these comments short here, the intro comments. Why philosophy of myth? There's a lot of reasons people could give for this, but I want to speak to my own interest and what motivated me to do this. This conference is part of a larger research project. It's a research grant on Ernst Cassirer's Philosophie der symbolischen Formen, Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Volume 2, Mythical Thought, which investigates the autonomy of mythology, or the special form by which myth is distinguished from other forms of culture, like language, science, and art. Because of the influence and impact of Schelling for Cassirer's project, both Schelling and Cassirer think of myth as tautogorical. They think of it in terms of tautogory. We have a lot of talks on Schelling here, and I speak for myself in saying that over the past 5 years or so, I've become quite an Schelling enthusiast, even if I'm not yet an expert on it. So I'm hoping to learn from all of you here. We have a lot of different papers besides the Schelling and Cassirer. We have the people talking on Nietzsche, Blumenberg, Strauss, and others. We have 3 talks on Japanese philosophy, myth and Japanese philosophy. So that's also very exciting. And since here we are, I'm here in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a place where East meets West, and the hope here is that also not only is the conference very international. We have people from all over the world, from Europe, North America, from Asia, and elsewhere, but that in the content itself, that we'll have some comparative philosophy going on as well. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to address the question of myth, its being and its relevance for philosophy in the 21st century. And I'm not going to address everything of relevance in respect to myth in my opening remarks. It's more or less a longer-ish paper. I won't mention or discuss a lot of notable and important issues related to myth, such as sacrifice, ethics, and politics, and the like. My focus will be more on kind of epistemic and metaphysical questions that are of import for me, the relevance for me, and why myth, I think, is central to some of these questions. And at the end of my introductory remarks, we will take a break, and then hopefully we'll come back at 4:45. The break may be only about 10 minutes, and we'll come back at 4:45 to hear Amin Allred's talk. He isn't here yet, but I hope that he will arrive by the designated time. So if not, we'll go on to Jesper and he will lead us off. Okay. All right. So without further ado, the mythical absolute, the fiction of being. So part one, the philosophy, the problem of philosophical consciousness. Philosophy is, because philosophy is, in order to understand itself and the kind of being that constitutes philosophy, philosophy should inquire into what it is to be of being. What is it to be in general? Being is arguably the unity of all beings, insofar as it expresses that in virtue of which each being is a member of the totality of everything that exists. The questioner is investigating the predicate that would distinguish being, what it is that would set being apart from beings. Accordingly, the interlocutor ought to reply as follows: being is such and such. Being does not differentiate between any things. To proclaim that a being is does not differentiate it from any other being that is. As Schelling has taught us, being is gleichgültig. However, the predicate is absolutely undifferentiated, immediately negates itself. Each being is a being, this or that being. Each is a particular being distinguished from and relative to others. Because all other beings, besides being itself, are differentiated from each other, the predicate undifferentiated specifies the way that being is different from all other beings. The predicate undifferentiated differentiates being from all relative differentiated beings. And so as a result, one can say that being itself is one differentiated being among others, since its undifferentiated character makes it different from all differentiated and relative things. Being is also the totality of all beings. Since the distinguishing feature of being is its indistinctness, and given that we can quantify over all beings, being itself cannot be distinct from any being. Because it cannot be distinct from any being, it cannot be distinct from any differentiated or relative thing. Because being is indistinct from everything, being has no limit and must thereby be an absolutely unlimited totality. The unlimited totality is not relative to anything else, for everything else falls within it. Thus, being is absolute. So the first conclusion I want to draw here is that being is an unconditioned universal, it's a being, and it's the totality of all beings. Thus, it must be true that being is both undifferentiated and differentiated. And this is a contradiction for at least two reasons. First, it's a contradiction because being undifferentiated allows for no difference whatsoever, and yet being is both differentiated and undifferentiated. And second, because being is undifferentiated, it cannot be different from what is differentiated, right? Or it's in virtue of its very lack of difference that it is identical to everything relative and differentiated. Face to face with this contradiction, philosophy stands dumbfounded before what Rudolf Otto called the sacred, the mysterium tremendum. Part two, absolute dialetheism. As Marcus Gabriel writes in Mythology, Madness, and Laughter, there is no, quote, ultimate way of undoing contingency, of eliminating the paradoxes of the domain of all domains, close quote. Every philosophical conception of the absolute, I would argue, leads to contradiction, and I tend to think this is unavoidable. Accordingly, we are invited to affirm absolute dialetheism. This is the view that the absolute is and can only be conceptually articulated as a contradiction. Because every concept of the totality leads to contradiction, some contemporary philosophers, such as Badiou or Gabriel, have inferred that the totality or the absolute is not. Can the existence of the absolute be rescued or salvaged from such critiques? I think we stand before two plausible paths or two possible paths. Either philosophy can reform the logic of the concept or abandon the concept as the privileged means to know the absolute. On the first option, in order to salvage the conceptual approach to the absolute, one must deny that the principle of non-contradiction is a necessary condition for conceptual truth. By rethinking the logic of the concept, philosophy can attempt to rescue the conceptual approach to absolute knowledge. This reformist position I've called a kind of rational dialetheism. It can take many forms. For example, one can attempt a formal paraconsistent logic after the manner of Grand Priest, or a non-formal one as developed by Hegel. Of course, Hegel folds in the formal within his own conception. On the second option, or I say on this alternative or non-rational response to this paradox of being, one could instead say, rather than take the rational approach of reforming logic, that all attempts at reform are abandoned. And on this view, the principle of non-contradiction would be a principle governing all conceptual form, and according to the PNC, contradictions cannot be true. Because every concept of the absolute on this model falls into contradiction, and no concept of the absolute, therefore, could be true. Thus, concepts can never truly articulate the totality, and the absolute truth would transcend all conceptual determination. And this is what I call mystical dialetheism. Thus, on this alternative view, to conceive the absolute, one must abandon the concept as a means of knowing the absolute or the totality. Although Wittgenstein thought in this direction when he proclaimed the existence of the world to be the mystical, it is most clearly advanced by the Kyoto School thinkers, and in particular Keiji Nishitani, in his seminal text, Religion and Nothingness. Today, we see further inclinations in this direction of mystical dialetheism by thinkers such as William Franke or William Desmond. Insofar as being transcends our concepts, philosophers find themselves anxiety-stricken and confronted with what Blumenberg calls the absolutism of reality. Knowing how to respond to this aporia, I believe, is the key to any future philosophy of the absolute. Do we pursue a rational dialetheism or a mystical dialetheism? Which direction do we think in? In order to make a philosophically informed decision, we should, however, understand in each case what it is we are affirming. Towards that end, for the sake of thinking through the consequences of the mystical position, in these reflections, I'll focus on the so-called mystical form of dialetheism and abstain from reflecting on the reformist position that tries to rethink logic. I've done a little bit of work on this reformist or rational dialetheism in my recent book on Hegel, where you can read about my account of Hegel's attempt to rethink the concept. I argue that if we endorse, so this whole set of reflections is hypothetical, and it's a way to give some insight into how I think about the role of myth in this set of problems. If we endorse mystical dialetheism, then we should be prepared to embrace a return to mythical consciousness. Okay, part 3, problem of religious consciousness. So if we take this second approach, this mystical dialetheism, the absolute then on this view exceeds all concepts, and the practice by which the absolute is revealed should therefore be a non-conceptual attentiveness to the absolute, a form of meditation that eschews conceptual mediation. Since such a consciousness does not draw any conceptual distinction, it does not draw a conceptual distinction between itself and the absolute. As Nishitani formulates it, the awareness of the absolute would be, quote, the real self-awareness of reality, close quote, or the absolute's immediate consciousness of itself. This is nothing but mysticism, for mysticism is, first, a non-conceptual experience of the absolute, but two, in which one is the absolute that one knows. The certain reading of Schleiermacher, one could say that religion wishes to intuit the universe. As Nishida acutely observes in his book Basho, because such awareness is radically non-conceptual, and all contradiction requires the presence of the concept, religious consciousness no longer encounters any such contradiction. Religious consciousness can resolve the problem of self-contradiction of the absolute by ceasing to conceive altogether. Although the contradiction remains unresolved in thought, it is resolved by transcending thought. However, since mysticism attempts to know the absolute by transcending all determinations of the absolute, mysticism seems to exclude relative and differentiated being and knowing. Since mystical intuition excludes the relative knowing, it itself becomes relative, as Hegel argued in Phenomenology, for it appears to be other to differentiated and mediated knowledge. Indeed, if the absolute is unknowable in any relative form, then it is not absolute, for the form and structure of relative knowing conditions its very being. By itself, the mystical absolute seems to fail to be absolute. It must also be relative too. Therefore, if we endorse the mystical form of dialechism, we find ourselves in a further dilemma. The absolute can neither be known conceptually nor non-conceptually. So the dilemma just gets worse and worse and worse. Part 4, out of the impasse, absolute art. As undifferentiated, the absolute cannot tolerate the distinction between the universal and the particular. But this is exactly the thinking we fall into when we think about the absolute, that it's both being and a being. But this difference between universal and particular is exactly what conceptual determination insists upon. For the universal, qua universal is not particular, and vice versa. Because of the indifference to difference, being the unconditioned universal cannot help but be a relative particular being. Accordingly, to bring the absolute into a form of relative knowing requires the following criteria. One must uncover not only a form of relative thought, but also a form of relative thought that identifies the universal with the particular, and that can do that successfully. And it doesn't seem that that's what the concept can do. So in the following, I want to motivate this concept of the imaginative universal as a way of thinking about thought that may be able to successfully fulfill these criteria and bring the absolute into a relative form in a way that the concept cannot. Being, or the absolute, is empty of all determinations, as we just said. If the absolute is to acquire some form, some relative form, this form must be acquired from the domain of relative and differentiated beings. As Heidegger himself eventually realized, every thought about being renders it a being. The absolute is such and such constrains the absolute to a relative determination. Every thought about the absolute synthesizes it with the relative into one identity. Every thinking of the whole selects an element of the whole and raises it to the status of the absolute. Since the absolute is empty of determinations, or is no determination at all, the act of raising the element to the whole is a process whereby what has absolutely no form in thought receives a relative form in thought. The absolute becomes relative by means of raising the relative to the absolute. Without the attribution of the relative to the absolute would not be in thought. Thus, by raising the relative to the relative gives the absolute the status of being something in thought. Now, since the imagination is an act of thought by which the object is grasped as a sensuous particular, and being is a universal, by imagining being, the imagination can think the unconditioned universal as a particular, and a sensuous one at that. Since this creates a novel identity for the absolute, this particular act of the imagination could be described as synthetic, for synthetic acts are ampliative. In short, it is the synthetic imagination that can think the indeterminate absolute through some sensuous, relative, and particular content, such as an image or a sound, whereby the absolute becomes mediated and relative and acquires determinate identity in thought. To employ a term from Vico, this particular universal is the imaginative universal. To eschew the form of the concept does not mean to throw off the universal altogether, but to keep it in contradiction with itself. By bringing the universal into identity with particular, here we are close to the great Schelling in his system of transcendental idealism, where he writes, quote, "This productive power is the same, whereby art also achieves the impossible, namely to resolve an infinite opposition in a finite product. It is the poetic gift, the one whereby we are able to think and couple together even what is contradictory, and its nature is imagination," close quote. The imaginative universal is, to use a literary term, an act of synecdoche, which represents the whole by means of an element of the whole. Consider the following example. Jesus Christ is God. Jesus is God is an act of synecdoche. For the particular and relative human being, Jesus of Nazareth, is posited as an unconditioned universal being itself. The finite person is posited as the infinite God. In regard to the whole, whenever we claim that the absolute is such and such, we are engaging in some act of synecdoche. We are identifying the whole by means of some element thereof. Because the whole on this model has no relative being in knowing prior to the act of synecdoche, synecdoche gives the absolute its very identity in the domain of knowing. Synecdoche, to be sure, is a literary device. Nonetheless, here where it gives epistemic form to the absolute, it acquires an ontological function. Synecdoche is one kind of metaphor. Metaphor most generally is an act by which one carries the difference over. Metaphora. In an absolute synecdoche, one carries the relative over the difference between the relative and absolute. What applies in one domain, the relative, now applies in another domain, the absolute. The metaphor identifies what is non-identical, whereas the form of conceptual determination forbids the identification of the non-identical. The metaphorical act of imagination certainly does not forbid such an identification. Usually we know the identity of the characters in a metaphor before we use them. In Shakespeare's metaphor, Juliet is the sun. We know in advance who Juliet is and how she is different from the sun. However, independent of the metaphor, do we know what the absolute is? I don't think we do, for it has no identity in knowing apart from the use of the metaphor itself. Thus, the act of absolute synecdoche is fundamentally different in kind from the usual use and ordinary use of the metaphor. Absolute synecdoche forms the very identity of the absolute in knowing. It does not need to presuppose it in advance. As Hegel says in his poem, Aloysius, his poem to his friend Hölderlin, as maybe not a lot of people read Hegel's poetry, maybe for good reason, quote, fancy brings the eternal nigh to sense and marries it to form, close quote. That's the young Hegel, don't worry. It's Hegel grew up and sobered up a little bit. That's the young Hegel. Absolute synecdoche is creative, for in virtue of its transference of the relative to the absolute comes to be something in knowing. Accordingly, the synthetic imagination is not just ampliative, but also creative. We could also introduce the concept of genius here as the one who gives the rule to nature, namely the one who invents the very model that is employed by others. The creation of the epistemic form of the absolute could be conceived as an act of genius. This act of genius is not guided by any rational measure. The genius is that creative artist who achieves what Socrates cannot, the realization of the relative in the absolute and the absolute in the relative. That it makes the ordinary extraordinary, as Novalis says. What is ampliative or novel in the act of genius is the way that the genius raises the relative to the absolute, for which neither rule nor model exists in advance. Socrates must learn to make music, as we discover at the end of the Phaedo. Or sorry, at the beginning of the Phaedo, not the end of the Phaedo. Although there is no a priori rational standard given in advance, the artistic creation of the absolute nonetheless ought to live up to the experience of the failure to know the absolute conceptually, that is constitutive of the Socratic experience. Although Socrates cannot achieve a complete representation of the absolute without turning to creative imagination, the direction of his creative imagination ought to live up to this experience of the absolute in mystical non-knowing. Philosophy can and should inform the direction of the act of creation without undermining its character. Of course, not all absolute creations of the artist are true, for not all creations reveal the absolute as a sublime transcendence of conceptual life. Thinking of the absolute as a machine, for example, I think is false for this reason. Because the absolute is all-inclusive, it excludes nothing. Thus, the creation of the form of the absolute in mediated knowing by means of the imagination does not occur outside of the absolute, but must be an act that occurs within the absolute itself. The unconditioned absolute is, in this respect, because it's not determined by anything outside of it, absolutely free or self-determining. If we think about genius as that in virtue of which the absolute acquires form in mediated knowing, and genius is itself an element of the absolute would determine itself by means of an element of itself. The etymology of genius indicates this as well, is one who is accompanied by an attendant spirit. It is both her work and the work of another, possessed by a power greater than herself. The music-making Socrates, by means of the creative imagination, autonomous and ungoverned by an antecedent rational principle, can bring the absolute into a relative form in knowing through absolute synecdoche. So although the creative imagination achieves what reason could not on this model of mystical dialetheism, the realization of the relative in the absolute, this achievement is an absolute achievement for and by the absolute. As Hegel writes, quote, God is God only insofar as he knows himself. His self-knowledge is further a self-consciousness in man and man's knowledge of God, which proceeds to man's self-knowledge in God, close quote. Okay, so now on to myth. I am going to talk about myth here. Part 5, the mythical absolute. So what does this have to do with myth? So far, I've discussed religion and absolute art as two interpenetrating forms of Weltgeist, of world spirit. On the one hand, religion, or mystical religion anyway, this is what I've been speaking about, is a kind of practice constituted by a non-conceptual intuitive relation to the infinite, whereby the infinite is revealed as it is. On the other hand, art is a mediated or reflected relative form in which the non-conceptual experience is revealed. Religion somehow seems incomplete without absolute art, for it doesn't seem to be able to achieve this mediated relation or relative relation to the absolute without it. Moreover, this mediated relation to the absolute achieved via absolute art must be, I want to argue, construed as a kind of myth, or it seems to involve myth. In its etymology, mythology is somehow involved with telling of a story. But what kind of logos is involved in myth? And here I want to begin by following how Ernst Cassirer understands myth. Cassirer offers a formula for mythical consciousness. So it's not just chaos or superstition. He says it is the law, it's governed by the law of the concrescence or coincidence of the members of a relation. And here, of course, I'm not following Cassirer's transcendental way of approaching it. So that should be pretty obvious already here. But nonetheless, I think that Cassirer is right to some significant extent about the form of mythical consciousness. Since the identity of the absolute, the unconditioned universal, consists in the very identity of particular with universal in the imaginative universal, in myth is constituted, according to Cassirer, by the identity of the members of a relation. In this case, the particular and the universal, the imaginative universal is essentially mythical. Miki, another Japanese philosopher, whom we may hear about later on today, is on point when he claims that, to quote him, the reality of this world must be founded by means of the logic of the imagination, close quote. And this logic, for Miki, is nothing other than the law of mythical consciousness, whereby he says, quote, the individual is universal and the universal is individual, close quote. We think about myth in terms of semiotics. The mythological law could be reformed or rethought as an identity of sign and signified. And this is also following Cassirer's understanding of myth. Given that the human being has the capacity and freedom to manipulate signs, such as words, and sign is not distinguished from the thing that is signified in myth, the sign is signified. In mythology, the human being tends to think they can manipulate whatever thing is signified by manipulating the signs themselves. In the mythological view of language, the word sign is identical to the thing that it connotes or denotes, such that by manipulating the word, one thinks one can manipulate the thing. And this is for Cassirer what underlies magic and belief in magic, magical consciousness in general. I won't talk about magic today, but I hope that at some point in the future, next 3 days, we can talk about magic a little bit, even if we're not going to do it ourselves. Because myth is constituted by an identity of word and thing, the word is not an allegory of another thing in the sense of allegory as speech about something else. To employ Schelling's concept, myth has a tautogorical form. Rather than speech about something else, tautogory means speech about itself, or self-referring speech. Because the absolute too, just to give more reasons to think of it this way, because the absolute is mythological on this conception, mythological speech is a kind of all-encompassing speech that cannot help but refer back to itself. What is more, because mythological consciousness identifies the universal and the particular says what the universal is. It does not represent a form that is beyond it. There is a Buddhist saying that reads, quote, the bird flies and is like a bird, close quote. Quite enigmatic on its surface, it is quite evident what is meant, at least in one respect. The likeness is the thing itself, not something other. The simile is the thing. For much of the 20th century, however, we did not learn Schelling's lesson and continue, in many respects, to read myth primarily in an allegorical way. We can see allegorical readings of myth in Levi Strauss and Carl Jung, who provide prominent examples of allegorical readings of myth. I won't go into the details of the different ways that's done. Given that the sign is the signified, or we have this mythological law of the identity of sign and signified, and the sign is a sensuous content, it follows that the signified must also be sensuous. The signified is completely unified with the sensuous content. It's a kind of incarnated content through and through. Philosophical ideas of the absolute, such as God and being, on this model must become sensual. This is exactly how mythology is described in the oldest systematic program of German idealism, where mythology is the sensual realization of the idea. According to the oldest systematic program, quote, "First, I will speak about an idea here, which, as far as I know, has never occurred to anyone's mind. We must have a new mythology," close quote. Now, who is this person speaking? I don't really care so much. I know that's what everyone wants to talk about, but I want to talk about the idea of a new myth, okay? By the way, I tend to think it's Schelling, but I'll just leave it alone. I don't want to get sidetracked here. Once such ideas are given sensual form, the philosophically informed artist, the music-making Socrates, can give mythical form to the absolute via metaphor, synecdoche, and other devices. In the technical sense, an idea takes the absolute as its object, if in the German idealist tradition. Mythology as a sensual realization of this idea would provide a sensual realization of the absolute. On account of this long process of disenchantment from not only Plato, but even before him, through the Enlightenment, we have been accustomed to think about the term myth as synonymous with lie or deception. So somebody could look at this conference and say, is this philosophy of lies, philosophy of deceptions, philosophy of falsehoods of a particular kind? However, much in other respects, myth may have earned this reputation, and in many ways, perhaps it has. I don't think, at least on this model of mystical dialectism, we can say that myth is just a lie. First, I want to say that the absolute cannot exist on this model in a relative knowing except by means of this synecdoche that is specified of it. And secondly, since there is no rational form that governs the formation of myth, one cannot judge the images specified of the absolute as false because they fail to conform to that form, because there isn't one there. Still, the imaginative universal is still a fiction. It's a contingent being that somehow exists as a creation. Since this constitutes its very relative being and knowledge, one cannot say of its very fictional being that it itself is only fictional. Rather, somehow its fictional being is non-fictional, or what it is in itself. Without fictionality, it seems the absolute would not be true to itself. It wouldn't be absolutely absolute. Simply put, the absolute, insofar as it's true to itself, seems to be a fictional absolute. The absolute can only be true to itself if it exists in the form of a fictional truth, or what I'll call a true fiction. Myth is not synonymous with lie. On this model of mystical dialectism, it's something more like a true fiction, an identity of word and thing. As Kant says about poetry, it, quote, plays with the illusion which it produces at will, yet without thereby being deceitful, close quote. Considered abstractly, the genius is a kind of storyteller. Indeed, myth is a kind of story, but she's not just any storyteller. She tells the story of the absolute. Accordingly, in this context, the myth of genius could be a cosmological logos by means of metaphor and synecdoche that make any rational cognition of any element or domain of the absolute possible. It may also problematize it in various ways. The form of myth is itself the origin of the absolute in knowing. We should, of course, not forget Blumenberg's lesson that myth reduces the absolutism of reality. By such a reduction, reality becomes manageable. However, myth does not only reduce reality, it also expands it. Blumenberg, I think, overlooks to some extent the way that myth fulfills the absolutism of reality, the way that it saves and preserves it. Once we concede with Heidegger that the poetic word is the house of being, die Sprache ist das Haus des Seins, then we must also concede to him that only a God can save us. Without participation in the cognitive life of the imagination in mythology, the absolute would remain incomplete, untrue to itself in its very being, because it would remain excluded from human knowing. As Nietzsche reminds us, quote, the sphere of poetry does not lie outside the world, like some fantastical impossibility contrived in the poet's head. Poetry aims to be the very opposite, the unvarnished expression of truth, close quote. Now, maybe to give a kind of anti-Nietzschean reflection here, the Christian story offers us an illuminating example of how the mythological may give sensuous form to being. As we read in the Gospel of St. John, in the beginning was the Word, and arche and ho logos. This logos is a poetic, mythical logos. Christ, who is the Word, is a synthesis of finite and infinite, of God and man. Jesus Christ as God, as I said earlier, is a kind of synecdoche. The particular is posited as universal, the finite as infinite. The story, as well as the images and words that constitute it, one may object, cannot be verified to be true when we compare it with empirical or historical facts or sets of facts. And in this way, one would argue it's a kind of myth. However, as I've argued, myth is also true. It's a sensual rendering of the absolute, which is the original disclosure of being to us in a mediated or relative way. And without some kind of myth, maybe it's a different myth other than the Christian one, being has no form in mediated knowing. This Christian story about the birth and death of God as a person can be read as a myth that extends the human person to the absolute. But the story is itself a product, one could say, of a kind of genius that gives the absolute being, one could say, a true and yet fictional anthropomorphism. Myths are or can be read as the persona of being, the character that being takes on in the knowing subject. Okay, part 6, final section, the transformation of mythical consciousness. Like Schelling before him, in 2000, I think it was 2008, Gabriel declared in Mythology, Madness, and Laughter that we must set up a new mythology. And if we follow this mystical dialetheism, the fact that we must turn back to myth, or that we should turn back to myth, out of our alienated disenchantment, means that the turn to myth is a return and thereby a transformation of mythological culture. In order to understand how myth is transformed by its return, we should elucidate the status of myth prior to the process of disenchantment initiated by Greek philosophy. We must remember that originally myth is not aware of its creations as its own. Because these signs are sensuous or material, mythical consciousness does not seem to recognize the sense of what is signified as independent of the given material. Because of this identity of sign and signified, mythical consciousness encounters the meaning of the sign in the external material, which is given from without. Thus, mythical consciousness experiences its own signs as external material entities that determines it from without. As Castir states, the mythical form of mediation merely substitutes the given with its own signs. So according to Castir, originally mythology doesn't think about these products as its own or as products of genius or something. And so then it leaves open this question, what is the origin of myth? Philosophers have different ideas. Some say the unconscious, like Schelling. Blumenberg talks about Darwinism of words. We'll leave this aside for now. Having merely substituted things with its own signs, mythical consciousness experiences the products of its creative determinations of the world as independent forces that determine it. To quote Casira, in creating its mythical artistic forms, the spirit does not recognize itself in them as a creative principle. What is more, because myth has not differentiated universal from particular, and contradiction requires this differentiation of universal from particular, originally myth has not uncovered this contradictory character of its imaginative universal. Although philosophy could only develop its own autonomous form against myth and as critique of myth, philosophy has also been instrumental in the preservation of myth. Having drawn out the fundamental crisis between universal and particular, philosophy reads this distinction between universal and particular back into myth itself. Achilles is no longer courage itself, but a symbol of courage. Tautology could not survive the philosophical revolution. Myth is canceled as tautogorical and preserved as allegorical. As Luc Bresson documents in How Philosophers Save Myths, from the Sophists to the Stoics to the Neoplatonists all the way through the 20th century, myth is recast as allegory, as speech about something else. Philosophy may have preserved myth, but only at the cost of destroying its tautological character. Philosophy in its origin was set free from myth. However, if we follow this form of mystical dialetheism, we will have set mythology free for myth, for a return of myth and a return to myth. Naturally, this must not only initiate a transformation of philosophy, but also of myth itself. By returning to myth, myth is transformed into a free, or can be transformed into a free act that completes the work of reason, a synthesis of tautology and allegory that is fully self-conscious of its contradictory form. Originally, mythological consciousness is unaware of the imaginative and fictional status of its content. However, the poet who initiates the return to myth creates their myth with the lucid philosophical self-consciousness that their creations stem from the imagination. The philosophical poet, or to use a Nietzschean image, the music-making Socrates, knows them to be fictions. In addition, originally mythical consciousness ascribes to a kind of determinism, for it takes its mythological creations, such as the gods, to be external agents that determine the fate of the people. Since the music-making Socrates knows its story to be its own creation, it is no longer determined by an external agent, and thereby transforms myth into an expression of its freedom. As such, myth can be reimagined, as it does in Romanticism, as a creation of genius, which may not have been the case before. Human history can be rethought as a progressive realization that the human being is, to use a phrase from Schelling, God positing consciousness, they who convert the profane into the sacred. Moreover, because the return to myth is mediated by a thorough analysis of the form of the concept itself, here we're thinking of it as born from an engagement with the absolutism of reality and the conceptual aporia that arise. The music-making Socrates can be fully aware of the formula of myth, that in particular that it violates the normative principles of conceptual form, such as the principle of non-contradiction. Thus, having run through and beyond the reflective relation to the absolute, the music-making Socrates can be fully self-conscious that the form of its mythologizing is a contradiction. While the original mythical consciousness does not even acknowledge the contradiction implicit in its own utterances, and the philosopher traditionally denies these contradictions to be true, the music-making Socrates can both acknowledge and accept the truth of contradiction. The music-making Socrates can joyfully echo Hegel's hard truth. Contradiction is the rule of truth, and consistency that of the false. The return to myth presupposes the overcoming of philosophical or conceptual knowledge of the absolute. As a result, this new mythology cannot be pre-logical, to employ a misleading description already by Lévi-Brühl, but that which is post-conceptual. The return to myth fulfills a completely new function, the completion of reason's desire to know the absolute. About 5 more minutes and we'll be done here. Most importantly, by overcoming the conceptual relation to the absolute, the return of myth constitutes a revitalization and transformation of the tautogorical approach to myth. By canceling the conceptual relation to the absolute, the music-making Socrates not only cancels allegory, but can preserve it in a transformed tautogorical form. This synthesis of the allegorical and the tautogorical can be read out of the post-conceptual or contradictory form of myth. Because mythological awareness is defined by this identity of the relata, myth identifies universal with particular. Because the particular is identified with the universal, it does not signify anything beyond it. Rather, because the universal it signifies is identical to the particular, the sensuous particular refers to itself. Thus, the myth is self-referring, it's tautogorical. However, myth can only be a contradiction if the particular is not universal. Given the difference between universal and particular, the sensuous particular signifies something other than itself, the universal. Thus, myth is also allegory, the speech about something else. In short, the contradiction in myth can be most concretely characterized as the identity of allegory and tautogorical. Every reference to itself becomes a reference to another, and every reference to another, a reference in turn to itself. As Schlegel recognized, this return of the myth gives us a kind of ironic absolute or kind of ecstatic form. It's a kind of ironic allegoresis, presentation of the unpresentable, which calls for, as I would argue, if we follow this path of mystical dialechism, a new vision, a new dialectic vision of the absolute that integrates Schelling's tautogorical vision of myth with the allegorical one. Because the music-making Socrates acknowledges the difference between sensuous particular and universal, the universal can transcend the sensuous content of the particular. And as a result, the return to myth negates the simple materialism engendered by a tautogorical form of myth. Qua allegorical, the meaning of myth is an ideal form that transcends material. Hence, for the music-making Socrates, myth does not necessarily adhere to the materialism of mythical consciousness. However, because myth is also self-referring and tautogorical, the meaning of myth cannot be separated from the sensuous particular. Rather, even in the return, myth is the absolute incarnate. While the being of the absolute can transcend the material, the absolute should simultaneously be identical with it. Although the oldest system calls for a new myth, the return to myth does not demand that we tell a new story. Rather, it may only call for a rejuvenation or retelling of an old narrative. To use the Christian example again, there could be others, but this is one that I know. The Holy Trinity instantiates, arguably, this mythical law. Each person of the Holy Trinity is the whole of God himself, and yet only one person in the triune Godhead. Christ is God and yet begotten by the Father. The contradiction is unmistakable. The reference to the other is a reference to itself, the indivisible God who is three in one. To point out another example here, Christ points beyond himself to the Father when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet we find in the Gospel of John that in the beginning, Christ, who is the Logos, is God himself. Theos hen ho logos. Emmanuel, as this mythological realization of the absolute, is God among us in the story, the incarnated God, one person, fully God and fully human. Kierkegaard here, I think, is right. The Christian story can only be true on the condition that it affirmed the truth of contradiction. The Christ is the human who transcends humanity, God, the God who transcends God, or to use Pseudo-Dionysius's phrase, the hyperousia ousia, the being beyond being. As the oldest system has it, poetry has a higher dignity and will outlive the other arts, for it has this privileged relation to the absolute. Indeed, the higher dignity of poetry would consist in the fact that it would be the only form in which the absolute would be true to itself, in some kind of relative knowing. Poetry has this higher dignity, as the earliest system program says, for it is the power in virtue of which the unconditional is and can be known. The dignity of the human being in this situation is located in the divinity of her being as this self-creating and self-knowing power of the whole. But is the birth of the mythical absolute the death knell for philosophy and religion? Far from it. In this model of thinking, philosophy can be canceled, but it can also be preserved in religion. Likewise, religion can be canceled, but it can be preserved in art. Absolute art can be a synthetic unity of all three forms. This is my final reflection here. Philosophy, it seems, if we hold to this mystical dialetheism, seems to perish whenever it attempts to conceive the absolute. And as a result, philosophy turns to an immediate or non-conceptual consciousness of the whole, religion. However, within this new religious orientation, philosophy can be reborn as religious practice, as Tanabe would teach us, rather than expect philosophy to successfully correlate their concepts to the absolute. The task of philosophy can be re-envisioned as an activity whereby the trans-conceptual is revealed. In this way, philosophy cannot be deemed a failure if it fails to conceptually articulate or achieve demonstrative knowledge of the whole. Rather, it would be preserved as a religious practice whose goal is to disclose the trans-conceptual by virtue of its very failure. By ritually drawing conceptual distinctions into unity with the non-conceptual, philosophy can transform itself, even in this mystical dialetheism, into a form of religious practice by which the truth of the trans-conceptual is revealed. Religion, too, is canceled when it recognizes that its immediate relation to the absolute precludes relative knowing and therefore fails to realize the absolute. However, religion does not just disappear within this return of the poetic mythological consciousness. Without the religious experience of the ineffable absolute, the music-making Socrates would have no principle in virtue of which to create their myths. Consider the following metaphor: the absolute is a wilderness. This metaphor is an act of synecdoche that raises the particular, such as a forest, beyond its relative domain of application to the absolute. This imaginative synecdoche corresponds to the revelation of the non-conceptual character of the absolute experienced in philosophy's conceptual failure and religion's mystical Gelassenheit. The absolute is a wilderness is arguably a true metaphor, not because the concept of wilderness corresponds with a given object, but in virtue of the fact that it lives up to a non-conceptual experience of the absolute. Hence, religion here, even in the poetic mythical consciousness, is preserved within this mythological consciousness as the truth that guides absolute poeticizing. So it's not clear whether we should accept this mythical form of dialetheism, and you may think if this is what it entails, let's get rid of it. But if we are to take it up, I want to think about what are we committing ourselves to if we do take it up. And as Hegel reminds us, the true is the whole. And even in this form of mythical dialetheism, I think philosophy has a place that, say, isn't done justice to by figures like Cephalus in the Surrealist movement, which indicate that somehow with this return to myth, we just have to give up on reason. This is headless figure. Rather, philosophy is preserved within religion and religion preserved within art. All three forms of Weltgeist are alive at work in this kind of absolute art. Absolute art can be the singularity of world spirit. is one particular kind of world spirit and simultaneously the whole of world spirit, what Hegel calls singularity or Einzelheit. It is philosophy, religion, and art altogether. In a word, if we follow this form, this path of mythical dialechism, it's only in virtue of the philosophical and religious insight into the transconceptual and ineffable character of the absolute can the music-making Socrates write the poetry of the world. So that was a lot, and we have no time for discussion. So my apologies. What I would invite you to do as the days go on, and anybody who wants to talk about any of the ideas that I've brought up, just send me a message or we can talk later. I want to give us time for a break here before we start with the next talk. I hope some of these themes and topics were of interest to you. And at the very least, you got a sense of where my interest in myth comes from and what's motivating me to learn from all of you, especially about the historical understandings of mythology in the various ways that it's grasped in the tradition. Okay. So yeah, I want to welcome everybody again. I look forward to hearing all the papers and discussing these with all of you. So it looks like we're starting at 4:45, so we have about a 6-minute break. Aman isn't here yet, so we're going to follow up with him and see. Jesper, is it possible for you to go first in case he isn't here yet? Yep. All right. Thanks a lot. Okay, so we'll see you all in 6 minutes. Thanks for your attention. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. So it is 4:45, and so we are on schedule. So because it seems as though Aman is not with us yet, I think we can go ahead and begin with Jesper, if that's okay. And so you're on a little early, but thanks for being here. So, okay, so just as a quick kind of review of the organization here. So as you can see, the time slot here is from 4:45 to 5:30. So that's 45 minutes total. And that's 30 minutes for the talk, maybe about 15 minutes for discussion. If you want to use more of the discussion time for the talk, that's okay. But it is good if we have some time to talk. Don't follow my lead. Don't follow my model. Okay. So we can have some discussions with each other, even if we can't be together in person. And then we'll take a 15-minute break after each talk, so we have a chance to get tea or coffee or just recover or whatever. Yeah. If you have questions at the end of the talk, then you can either raise the virtual hand, because I think there's enough people that I can see everyone. You can raise the virtual hand, or you can just send put your name in the chat and send me a message in the chat. Okay, and then we'll just first come, first serve. Okay. All right. So Jesper Rasmussen is he recently graduated with his PhD from the University of Southern Denmark, right? I think that's right. And is an international postdoc at Aarhus University, right? Although you're working at Freiburg University, you're carrying out most of your research there, correct? Kind of. Okay, so you're in Freiburg a lot, yeah, doing good collaborations with people there. And I've met Jesper through Christoph Asmus' organization, and I've learned a lot from his talks, especially his work on Schelling. So I'm excited to hear his talk today, which is entitled Mythos as Self-Contained Intermediary, Nature, Reality, and Mythology in the Context of Schelling's System of Knowledge, 1800. So without further ado, take it away.
Thanks, Greg, for the kind words and introduction, and also for the organization and the invitation to talk here at this conference. And this is actually the theme from my doctoral dissertation in Odense and Freiburg. And now I am correctly in Aarhus as part of the last phase of a postdoc that I spent 1.5 years in Freiburg as postdoc in Freiburg. That's the first part. And now, today I will give a talk on Schelling's concept of a new mythology in his System des Transzendentalen Idealismus. And I will begin. So, just to be clear, you all hear me? It's okay? Good. In the 9th lecture of the historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology, Schelling reflectively turns his attention towards the condition of a philosophy of mythology. Approximating the new developments in his thinking to the earlier systematic appropriations of myth, he subsequently emphasizes the inner connection between philosophy and mythology, naming his own work, System des Transzendentalen Idealismus, System of Transcendental Idealism, as a precursor to the philosophy of mythology that he is now presenting. Immediately following this preliminary characterization, Schelling goes on to elaborate the notion of myth with a notion explicitly borrowed from Coleridge, namely, and we have already heard it, tautology, thereby emphasizing a striking kinship between myth and nature. Myth, as well as nature, Schelling argues, is characterized in virtue of its completeness. Contrary to attempts to reinterpret myths, they are rather self-contained and explicable without recourse to external fields. That is, they must be understood in their own right. Consequently, we should refrain from reinterpreting myth as immature science. For example, Christendom in spe, or reason in spe, and so on and so forth, as we know it from allegorical or symbolical interpretation of myth. So we are not allowed to, according to Schelling, understand them otherwise understand them as something other than they are in and of themselves. Despite the suggested independence of myth, Schelling nonetheless maintains a relative identity between myth and nature in virtue of their content. What distinguishes myth from nature, and consequently philosophy of nature from philosophy of mythology, is the form, that is, the means. The German term is Mittel, that is the means by the aid of which their content is known to us respectively. Whereas the content of the philosophy of nature can be constructed before our eyes and thus rationally be known in its genesis, the content of myths is simply given to us, incapable of any human rational constructions or reconstructions. The human being is, according to Schelling, simply not in possession of the means to create new myths consciously, be it based on nature, reason, moral grounds, or otherwise. Now, it has rightly been argued that this tautogorical conception of myth marks a turning point in Schelling's thought and receives its most systematic treatment in the lectures on the philosophy of mythology. Nonetheless, Schelling was deeply occupied with mythology his entire life, a fact that Schelling himself acknowledged. As has just been mentioned, he explicitly stressed this origin to the philosophy of mythology by referring to the system 1800 and Coleridge's notion of tautology. To capture the true meaning of the ancient myth, Coleridge coined this term based on his reading of Schelling's Über die Gottheiten von Samothrace from the year 1815 in Coleridge's On the Prometheus of Aeschylus from 1825. Although Schelling does not shy away from critically commenting Coleridge's clarification of the tautogorical myth as philosopheme, a notion Schelling himself applied positively to describe the ancient myth in his Tübinger studies on mythology, I will return to these, Schelling not only accepts Coleridge's concept as well as its philosophical connotation, but utilizes it in the subsequent lectures approvingly. The notion itself stems from Coleridge's The Statesman's Manual from 1816, which Coleridge published 1 year before his Biographia Literaria. This book, Biographia Literaria, was highly influenced by the early works of Schelling and even contained unmarked translation of excerpts taken directly from the 1800 system. Thus, Schelling's new endeavor explicitly as well as implicitly invites its readers to embed the philosophy of mythology within the horizon of his earlier philosophy. My paper today intends to accommodate Schelling's invitation as it aims to contribute to our knowledge of the developmental origins of the tautogorical conception of myth by addressing the question of mythology in the early period of Schelling's work, so the 1790s. Specifically, the paper focuses on system of transcendental idealism and tries to make sense of its closing lines on mythology. In the programmatic last words of the system of transcendental idealism, Schelling infamously proclaims the completion of his system of knowledge, System des Wissens, in the work of art and with the return of science, Wissenschaft, to poetry. The idealistic system as such, however, ends with Schelling's claim that the completion needs to take place against the backdrop of a mythology to come, that is, a new mythology. And I quote here in English, however, it is generally not difficult to say what the intermediary, his German word is Mittelglied, what the intermediary of the return of science to poetry will be, since such a middle element or intermediary existed in mythology before this, as it now seems, indissoluble separation occurred. But how a new mythology, which cannot be the invention of the individual poet, but of a new generation that can only imagine one poet, as it were, can come into being, this is a problem whose resolution can only be expected from the future fate of the world and the further course of history. So this is the English translation. I will spare you the German. We can come back to it in the discussion. So these enigmatic final words of Schelling in System of Transcendental Idealism will serve as this point of departure for providing a better understanding of the role of mythology as an intermediary, as a Mittelglied. What does this new mythology amount to systematically? My thesis today is that mythology serves as the medium that enables the completion of the system of knowledge, or more specifically, lets the absolute other, or in Latin, ubicere, that is that which is thrown against or thrown opposite, mythology serves as the medium that enables this completion of the system by letting the absolute subjective, the I, be confronted with the objective or the nature, the philosophy of nature, without reducing the former to the latter or vice versa. In a new mythology, I will argue the I meets a whole world of which it is neither the author nor the creator, but which subsequently can be reflected in the work of art in its entirety, thus completing the system of knowledge. The entire history of the I, that is the content of the philosophy of nature, as well as the philosophy of the I, transcendental philosophy, must be present in the new mythology, albeit in a new and self-contained form, namely that of the myth. So instead of looking onwards to Schelling's philosophy of art, where he also investigates or scrutinizes mythology, I suggest here to look backwards to his earlier Tübinger studies and Allgemeine Übersicht der neuesten philosophischen Literatur from 1798. So this goes contrary to the normal tradition of understanding Schelling's new mythology from 1800. And I will draw a bit on Carl Philipp Moritz and Schelling's studies of him too. So first, I will give a brief outline of what is going on in Schelling's system of transcendental idealism and why a mythology is needed there. So this is my next point, the system of knowledge from 1800, or the insufficiency of theoretical and practical reason. We learn from the introduction to his first outline, Einleitung zu seinem ersten Entwurf, an introduction that appeared after the actual outline. It appeared in the same year, namely 1799, and this first outline is supposed to be the other part of system of transcendental idealism, both of them thus forming a unity. So from this introduction, we learn a bit about this system that he wants to or achieves or attempts to ground around 1800, that he terms system of knowledge, System des Wissens. And I quote in English here, if it is the task of transcendental philosophy to subordinate the real to the ideal, it is, on the other hand, the task of natural philosophy to explain the ideal from the real. Both sciences are therefore one science, differing only in the opposite directions of their task, since furthermore, both directions are not only equally possible, but equally necessary. They also have the same necessity in the system of knowledge, end of quote. In the preface to the system of transcendental idealism, that is the work that appeared 1 year after this introduction and the outline, Schelling defines the task of transcendental idealism in such a way that it must be extended to include a system of all knowledge. So the system of transcendental idealism is not a system in itself, but only the one half of a system, the other being the philosophy of nature. And he refers there to his outline from 1799. This project is identical to the one that Schelling associates with the extension of the principle of transcendental idealism to all possible problems relating to knowledge. This leads him to a further sequence of stages, which, however, now consist of views from the stages between the I to consciousness, but which was prompted by the already uncovered, and I quote, parallelism of nature with the intelligent, end of quote. So Schelling, this is Schelling's parallel thesis, as it's often called in the literature, that nature and the I travel in opposite directions, but parallel to each other. However, according to Schelling, a complete representation of this so-called parallelism is, and I quote, possible neither to transcendental philosophy nor to natural philosophy alone, but only to both sciences, end of quote. So this is from the system of transcendental idealism. So in this system from 1800, this task is refined into the following theory of correspondence. So Schelling is outlining his entire system of knowledge here as kind of a theory of correspondence, the like of which we know from Thomas Aquinas. I here quote what Schelling means with natural philosophy or Naturphilosophie. I will quote it in German because it's the terminology here is important, and then I will translate it. So I quote German: Entweder wird das Objektive zum Ersten gemacht und gefragt, wie ein Subjektives zu ihm hinzukomme, das mit ihm übereinstimmt, end of quote. So either the objective is made to the first, there's the principle, and then our question is how a subject or something subjective comes to this objective in such a way that this that comes to the objective is corresponding with the objective. This results in a kind of, I call it a quasi-history of nature in Schelling. So this is Naturphilosophie. The important term here being hinzukommen, that something corresponds with another, not only arises from the other. On the other hand, he characterizes transcendental philosophy in the following way. I will again quote in German and translate it into English. And this is the other direction. Oder das Subjektive wird zum Ersten gemacht und die Aufgabe ist die, wie ein objektives Hinzukommen, das mit ihm übereinstimmt. End of quote. And I quote and translate into to English. Or the subjective, in Schelling's case, this is the I, is made the first or the principle, and then the task is following how something objective, and in the case of Schelling, this objective means nature, comes to this subject and corresponds with it. And this is the history of the I that Schelling sketches in System of Transcendental Idealism, something Schelling later on in his lectures on the history of philosophy he names this process of transcendental philosophy the transcendental history of the I. So this is the two sides of philosophy that Schelling hopes to bring together in order to form a system of knowledge. And none of them are complete in themselves, but they are needed by the other science. And just to remember you of, recall the quote that I was having in mind when referring to the Holy Thomas. It is, of course, his theory of truth as correspondence. Veritas est adequatio intellectus et rei. That is, truth is the correspondence between the intellect and the thing. So Schelling is transforming this in a systematic way, so as to say that his system is the system of truth, and this truth is brought about in such a way that it brings the subjective side, transcendental philosophy, together with the objective side, the side of nature. And again, I think Schelling here is using the term objective in the Latin form, that is that which is other of the subject, because it is still a form of activity. So the result is, what I cannot develop further now, is that neither the philosophy of nature nor transcendental philosophy achieves this by themselves. The main reason for this failure stems from the task itself. If we in philosophy must construct from a principle, we are forced to do so on the basis of these principles alone, out of which something different from this principle, something not enclosed in this principle, can never arise. We would be stuck in the subjective if our only means was the subjective side on the one hand. On the other hand, if we start with nature, we will be stuck with nature. So they have to come together, and it has to be shown how the one comes to the other, and this has to be done internally, according to Schelling. In both sciences, Schelling attempts to construct the principle of the other in the medium of reason, that is, a conscious act of uniting different elements found in the respective principle. In the system of transcendental idealism, this approach fails already on the level of theoretical philosophy. Furthermore, the attempt to solve it by the means of practical philosophy, for example, actions, morality, politics, and religion, also fails. And just to mention it briefly here, this is an implicit critique of Kant and also, of course, of Fichte. Kant allowed for constructions in mathematics as well as in morality. It's often forgotten that Kant in his theory of morality allows for construction of the ideal moral world of ends. Schelling says, no, this approach is doomed to failure. This is one of the theses of the system of transcendental idealism. So we need another means. And my thesis is that here he introduces myth. This forces philosophy to look outside itself in order to fulfill the task of completing the system of knowledge that this system itself has posed, an insight that brings us back to the quote I gave in the beginning. And here I will you already have heard it in English, so now I will give it in German, just to recall it. Welches aber das Mittelglied der Rückkehr der Wissenschaft zur Poesie sein werde, ist im Allgemeinen nicht schwer zu sagen, da ein solches Mittelglied in der Mythologie existiert hat, ehe diese, wie es scheint, unauflösliche Trennung geschehen ist. Wie aber eine neue Mythologie, welche nicht Erfindung des einzelnen Dichters, sondern eines neuen, nur einen Dichters gleichsam vorstellenden Geschlechts sein kann, selbst entstehen könne, dies ist ein Problem, dessen Auflösung allein von den künftigen Schicksalen der Welt und dem weiteren Verlauf der Geschichte zu erwarten ist. So what is needed is a mythology of reason. Not, I would here claim, the one we introduced to in the oldest program of German idealism, because that is explicitly, I read it in this way, a political myth. And the myth that Schelling is introducing here, this is rather a scientific mythology, or a mythology of reason that unites the history of nature with the history of the eye. But how are we then to make sense of this myth, if not by means of reason? Already in the quote given, some criteria for this myth are obvious. It cannot be an invention of an individual, but must be an invention of a whole generation, Gattung. It is hence, this myth, no mere invention of fantasy, but will, in contrast to the rivaling theory of mythology by Friedrich Schlegel, arise out of history and for the individual, as it were, unconsciously. A couple of years later, Schelling alters this approach by attempting to construct this relation in intellectual intuition. He pursues this way of understanding myth in his philosophy of art, in his identity system. And this is the reason why I believe that we should be careful to understand this concept of a new mythology in system of transcendental idealism in the light of the identity philosophy. I think there are differences between the two notions of myth in the identity philosophy and the system of transcendental idealism. So now I come to my approach by looking at this concept of myth on the backdrop of Schelling's earlier works. So in early Schelling, it is possible to differentiate between three phases of mythology. There's the early studies in Tübingen, the questions of mythology regarding the possibility of science, of history in his contribution to Fichte Niethammer's journal Allgemeine Übersicht der neuesten philosophischen Literatur from 1798. This is the second phase, and the third phase then being the new mythology of the system of transcendental idealism. So I will go through them briefly in sequence. First, the Tübinger studies. In Schellings über Mythen, historische Sagen und Philosopheme der ältesten Welt from 1793, Schelling introduces the notion of a philosophical myth, philosophisches Mythos, Philosopheme, hence he calls the content of these myths. The character of the philosophical myth is to be understood as a sensualization of something not clearly known, but introduced or presented by means of the imagination. To characterize this notion, Schelling introduces the term a history-like form of presentation, the German terminology being that these kind of myths, these philosophical myths, are presented in the form of, and the German is geschichtsähnliche Darstellung. They are history-like forms of presentation of the transcendent as a form of poetic explanation of a given phenomena. The philosophical myth itself is the living presentation of a self-enclosed world and its origins. As such, the philosophical myth is to be understood out of itself, that is, without recourse to anything else. It thus expresses its own perfection, Vollkommenheit. This notion Schelling borrows from Carl Philipp Moritz, and he has read Moritz's work, Götterlehrer. Moritz's work came out 1791, and Schelling's dissertation is from 93. and he's also read some of the other of Moritz's works. This philosophical myth is contrasted with a historical myth whose purpose is to provide an authentication of a historical fact. Accordingly, the examination of a historical myth is to distinguish true content from false content of this given myth. This is of importance for theology only, for theology assumes that the Bible contains revelation, so we can say which revelations are true, which are false in the historical myth. So Schelling assigns theology the task of dealing only with the historical myths, thus clearly limiting theology in order to hand over the philosophical and higher myth to other interpreters. And this is, of course, directed against his professors in Tübingen, Stor and Flat, and so on. He tried to revive theology and Christianity for the present age. And in this pursuit, Schelling is also rejecting Heine's view and Lessing's view of mythology. They tried to understand the ancient myths as forms of early reason, so this allegorical interpretation of myth. This fact, I believe, has in the Schelling scholarship often been denied with reference to a single statement of Schelling, namely that the oldest myths are an expression of a spirit of childhood. Schelling says that these myths are stems from a Geist der Kindheit, and this sounds like Heine's or Lessing's views. This Lessing, you know the work, The Christianity of Reason. However, Schelling explicitly rejects such allegorical and other views on myth as fables, due to these views, reduction of myth to something else, such as reason or morality, and this would conflict with the perfection of the myths that Schelling proposes. He says that myths are self-enclosed world, represents the self-enclosed world, so they cannot be understood in terms of, for example, modern or contemporary reasons. So, and this is one statement from Schelling, Geist der Kindheit, that often make interpreters says that Schelling is himself just an Enlightenment thinker here. I says it's a more complex case. I think Schelling's trying to find his way here, because he's proposing what could look like a categorical concept or notion of myth here. So his early studies of mythology still do not allow the concept of myth to be transferred to his own present. And the question of a new mythology is not even mentioned in these works. He could have learned about the concept of a new mythology by Herder, whose work he also goes through, but he doesn't. Important for him here is that theology must not bypass the new philosophy that we know from Kant, and in this bypassing see a higher revelation in the dogmas from ancient times. With this approach to mythology that offers a theoretical purpose, that is Schelling's, it is possible for him to limit theology by including Enlightenment elements. In my opinion, Schelling hereby gains an insight that enables him to learn something from his studies of the myths, namely about the spirit, Geist, and form of the presentation found in myths. This is also, I think, visible in his studies of Plato. Plato's Timaeus, for example, and Schelling is obsessed with Plato's notion of eikos mythos, a probable story in Timaeus, which would be a form of a myth, a philosopheme or a philosophical myth, according to Schelling. What enlightened reason has gained in clarity, according to Schelling, vis-a-vis the ancients, it lacks in liveliness, historicity, and immediacy in their presentations. According to this determination, myth can offer both truth and liveliness, as well as an ordered, meaningful world that is a cosmos, including its origins. So this is Schelling's view. This becomes particularly clear when Schelling considers myth in relation to explanations of nature in his early writings, something he borrows from Moritz. With the philosophical myth, a system that is not abstract comes into being along with a regularity that shapes the myth. The poetics of the myth, although it is an invention of the inner form of the myth, is nevertheless not arbitrary, but fits the truth that it is to be presented. Furthermore, it is not transcendent in the sense that the explanatory ground is considered essentially different and separate from its origin. Rather, what is transcendent, according to Schelling in the philosophical myth, is that it does not appropriate what is to be explained from the human being, but attempts to understand the human being from a non-human standpoint, which, however, is essentially related to human beings, namely as the creation of this, as the origin of this human being. A myth is something in which the human being finds itself within a world that is forced upon the human being. So it's not just pure arbitrariness. There's some kind of necessity inherent in myth, according to Schelling. By means of myth, therefore, the reality, and his term here is Wirklichkeit, of an abstract, not yet clear world becomes accessible to some times or some ages. In this way, the highest truth, according to Schelling, for example, the origin of the world, is brought before our eyes. Even though the myths are told, and hence a product of imagination, they force themselves, so Schelling, upon the wise who tells these myths. So this is the first phase. We have this thesis from Schelling that myth has to do with reality and the concretization of the highest truth. They are lively and they are historical-like. This is important. Now I turn to the second phase in Leipzig. In this phase, Schelling examines myth in context of his investigations into the possibility of a philosophy of history and a true history of nature. According to this expansion of his earlier works, the poet can depict natural occurrences in such a way that they become historical. Geschichtsähnliche is the German term. Schelling tries to illustrate this with the example of the historian. According to Schelling, the historian is also a poet, which can be confirmed in his depiction of natural events. The historian depicts more than the mere occurrences of nature, and he must do so if he does not simply want to repeat them as occurrences of nature. In order to be able to include these occurrences in nature, the historian gives natural events a higher meaning. And I bring here a quote to show you this. I quote Schelling from Allgemeine Übersicht der neuesten philosophischen Literatur, 1798. For this reason, the writer of history, who's always at the same time a poet, is granted a kind of superstition. For if he understands his art, he will not easily include any natural occurrences in history without allowing more than mere nature, a higher, although hidden hand, to be assumed. In all sciences, history has preceded theory. Thus, Greek mythology, wherever its birthplace may be, was originally nothing else than a historical schematism of nature, which had not yet begun to be explained. Thus, every doctrine of things of a supersensible world, because we have no laws of nature for this world, becomes history, and every religion that is theoretical passes over into mythology and will and ought to be mythology and never become anything else. For it can have only poetic truth at all, and only as mythology is it true. End of quote. Schelling thus brings the idea of a higher nature together with its appearance of freedom, but in the realm of the theoretical. He describes this hypothesis as, and I quote, a very daring one, which may even seem to some to border on the adventurous, end of quote. This stated hypothesis that all individual organizations are to be regarded as the developments at different stages of a general organization resembles at least some of his own positions in his natural philosophy. Hence, myths have with one stroke been brought near the present, that is contemporary times of Schelling, although the ancient ones, along with religion, have to stay ancient, that is, in the past. What is won through a mythological presentation is the role of completion. As a middle ground of both, between theoretical and practical philosophy, these myths can complete a theory and a praxis, that is, make them into a system. So, and now I turn to the third phase. I've already mentioned it. Here, Schelling unfolds his brief considerations from 1798. He repeats some of them and he unfolds them. Systematically, he now introduces mythology in his consideration of the concept of history. That is, he introduces mythology between history and nature, or more precise, as a transition between nature and history. He does that in the 4th chapter of System of Transcendental Idealism. The mythical content is neither absolutely free, history, nor is it pure necessity, nature. Rather, it is an expression of the ground between both. Myth is supposed to unite humanity with that which appears to it in history, completely detached and in its otherness, its nature. Myths thus indicate this through a narrative. They are eine Erzählung, he says. But as myth, it is more than a mere invented narrative and tells the story precisely how nature transformed itself into history, or how freedom emerged from nature in a concrete and lively form. It concerns the question, in other words, it concerns the question of life in general, Leben. And I mentioned here, life of the human being as well as that of nature. A new mythology would in this sense amount to a mythology of reason. If we draw the implication of this view for the completion of the system of knowledge, we see that myths occupy a middle ground in the system. The new myth, introduced in the closing words of System of Transcendental Idealism, these myths are intermediaries, or this myth is an intermediary. There's namely only one myth that unconsciously unites that which cannot be united consciously through acts, practical or otherwise, or constructions from theoretical philosophy. This new coming myth, as Schelling says, is neither practical nor theoretical philosophy, but arises out of history as a narrative that, finally, in the work of art, by the help of the genius, is giving a single concrete figure, Gestalt, which will make philosophy conscious of this world. That is, philosophy, the artist will unite the conscious and unconscious in a form of knowledge. And this then is the foundation of the system of knowledge of 1800. So to sum it up, in the myth, in this new myth, it becomes possible to see how the other, that is the objective, nature, came to the subjective, the absolute I, namely by telling the story of the rise of the I out of nature, that is the story of the transcendental past of the I. Thus, this new mythology prepares the material for the genius who, in the artwork, unites the entire worldview, the new myth, in a single product. So this is the whole rational worldview being established here. So I come to a very short conclusion and an outlook. According to Schelling in System of Transcendental Idealism, the myth is a non-reducible intermediary between philosophy of nature and of the I. As such, it gains a systematic function that it did not have in the earlier phases, and a function that it does not have in his philosophy of mythology from his later period. This naturally leads to worries, which I will leave for the discussions. For example, that this philosophy of mythology again makes philosophies to something that serve a purpose external to themselves. Furthermore, it posits the question if such a myth could ever arise. Schelling always puts this in this period, the new myth in a distant future, unreachable for the individual. Hans Poser has once lauded Schelling for exactly this point, that he, Schelling, in contrast to Friedrich Schlegel, never introduced a new mythology, but placed it well out of reach for humankind, thereby undermining every utilization of myth for ideological purposes. So, in conclusion, I will pose another but related question for the discussion. Is it possible to identify examples of such mythologies, or are they only empty talks of Schelling? Or do Schelling only offer us an outline of that which is needed for completion of a system, but which we only know formally? My question simply is, what would such myths look like in concrete? So in my current project that Greg already mentioned, I look on the cosmological outlines, the metaphysical endeavors to present a new worldview in the 1840s and 50s. In this period, natural researchers such as Alexander von Humboldt, Hans Christian Ørsted, and Gustav Fechner worked out collected that grand worldviews based on the scientific state of the arts, the cosmos, spirit and nature, Zenda Vesta, all appearing around 1850. Would they be representatives of such a new mythology? Or an answer I have rejected elsewhere. Would Latour's Gaia myth that he proposed 2013 count as a qualified new myth for present worlds? So with these questions, I will end my talk and thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot for your talk, Jesper. Okay, so we have some time for questions. I think we can take 10 minutes or so and then just take a 10-minute break, okay? So if you have any questions, you can either raise your hand virtually or physically, or you can just send me your name in the chat and then, okay, Michelle Hakel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, Jesper, thank you for your presentation. I've got just one question. I think it's a very interesting topic, working on the relation of science, mythology, and nature. You used the term scientific mythology, and now I've got just one question concerning about the method. I'm interested in the question, how is the philosophy of nature, especially in the early works of Schelling, and his philosophy of mythology connected? That means, how is there they're methodically linked? For example, if you have a look at the philosophy of nature, it is closely linked with the concept of absolute identity. And so it's a structure which is, it's important for the whole concept of his thinking. And how does it work in relation to the mythology? Yeah, right.
Thanks for the question. And the philosophy of mythology, you mean from the later period? Yeah. Thank you for the question, and it's a really good question. And it also relates to what is positive philosophy, right? Because in the later period, the philosophy of mythology serves another purpose than I believe the philosophy of mythology in the early period does. It is kind of a preliminary or a preface, so to speak, to the positive philosophy. In some places he says that. And the question, if you look at the philosophy of mythology from the later period, you have these different forms of mythological consciousness, and he speaks very rarely of nature. At some points he actually does, and I think he does so when he comes to criticize Carl Philipp Moritz, for example, because Moritz is the one who takes Kant's concept, or a concept close to Kant's of the artwork, and brings it close to nature. Schiller goes the other way and says the artwork reminds of morality. Moritz says no, these artworks are kind of reflections of the gods, of the highest nature, of the highest principles. So I think methodologically, these two forms of philosophy of mythology are rather distinct. They serve another purpose. But there are similarities too, right? Because the philosophy of mythology is a series of consciousness, and this is not the case for his new mythology or his early studies in Tübingen, although they are of course very limited. It's not a systematic approach in Tübingen and in Leipzig and in Jena. They are not a systematic presentation of all forms of philosophical myths. He focuses very specifically on the ancient myth, and I think he does so also as a part of a critique of the theology in Tübingen. So I don't know if that really answers your questions, because of course the concept of the absolute identity is much more present in 1800. But there's this genetic approach and trying to figure out what does it mean. What does these life worlds mean? Another concept I could have used is how should we understand and how should we scientifically treat life worlds? We cannot do it. His thesis in 1800 would then be, we cannot do it theoretically. We cannot do it practically. It's another kind of presentation, which I have here tried to focus in on with the concept of geschichtsähnliche Darstellung. It's not history, because that's pure Willkür. It's not nature, because that's necessity, in this form of necessity that Schelling talks of in 1800. But it's something between. And I think this geschichtsähnliche Darstellung, I don't think that's present in the later philosophy of mythology, although we of course has this focus on historicity, right?
Yeah, maybe a brief follow-up.
Just one more remark, it's possible?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think it helps me to understand the problem, but probably one more question. But even in the early works on mythology, is there a rational structure in it?
Yeah.
And how does it work? So.
Yeah, because yes, and that's I tried to. I didn't unfold it. I have a paper and have to like take parts out of it. He calls them exactly philosophical myths, and he uses the term philosopheme, right? So he says they are structured wholes, self-contained, self-enclosed wholes. They are perfect. They are vollkommen. So they offer a complete structure. And of course, Schelling here, I think in the early Tübinger studies, he doesn't really know which way to go, right? He stands a kind of a thin line. So you can either fall back into enlightenment, that's preforms of reasons, or they are actually on the same heights as that of reason. He doesn't answer this question. I think some of my thesis was only that his earlier works could be used to explain what he maybe could have in mind in 1800. He says he has this thesis, this Abhandlung über die Mythen. He has this dissertation on myth in his drawer. It will come out later. He says that in a footnote in System of Transcendental Idealism, right? He mentioned the myth, and he then says, I have this dissertation on myth lying in my drawer. I will publish it just hereafter, but he never did. But you're right, there's some kind of rational structure.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, Sakura, please. It's all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, can you hear my voice? Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your fascinating presentation, Jesper. And so I also am very interested in the philosophy of Schelling. And so my question is related on the difference between the early work to the late works of mythology by Schelling, and already so about the late works, so you answered. And so my question is about the philosophy of art based on the philosophy of identity. And so maybe so later, so I will present this theme. And so I think so the philosophical system was changed. So at each level, each level, and but so the subject or themes and terms are repeated so again and again. So for example, so the ancient and the modern or new mythology is also repeated in the philosophy of art, lecture philosophy of art. And so I think so in the philosophy of art, so can classify the different genres of art into different period or different artworks, and so different folks. But in the system of the transcendental philosophy or earlier work is only the only one or the four of ideas. So how can we understand or how can we find so the difference other the positive or negative, so that philosophy of identity is evaluated so in the negative but I think so this point we can talk much so deeply. So the theory of mythology, how do you think about the difference?
Yes, thanks for your question. It's a very good one. And I know that my thesis, I made my thesis kind of provocatively against all those people or the scholars who try to understand these, because it's really only a proposition, right? It's this proposition that I quoted, where Schelling mentions a new mythology. He mentions mythology earlier on in System of Transcendental Idealism, and many says, okay, we have to interpret this in light of the identity philosophy. But if I understood you correctly, I agree that in the identity philosophy, something new happens. And what I didn't really, something new happens. There are continuities as well, and he's able to, in the identities system, to say more about different forms of mythologies as different forms of art, and so on and so forth. But what has changed is that he says that himself in the Philosophy of Art lectures, that he constructs mythology. And a construction for Schelling is a philosophical approach that is, I would say, always a part of a conscious act. And his earlier, I think this 1800 conception, it differs from this approach by saying, no, myth can only arise unconsciously. They're somehow different and other, foreign or alien to philosophy. And this alienness is then removed from the identity philosophy, is so the basic points. Of course, the downside of this is that he doesn't really know how to treat mythologies. This was also my worry, right? Do we even know what a mythology is in this system? Schelling doesn't mention any examples, and I then considered maybe we could find them in these cosmologies. I don't know if this answered your question in any way.
Good. Yeah, so Sakura, do you have any follow-ups or anything to add?
Okay, so in the philosophy of art, for example, so he also are the element of nature, and it is significant for the new mythology. And he also talked or argued the unachievability of the new mythology. So I can discuss the continuity or development from the early works to the identity philosophy.
You're completely right. You're completely right. The focus on nature and mythology is, if you only look at system of transcendental idealism, much stronger in the philosophy of art lectures. I only inferred them through this reading from the Tübingen studies and onwards. You're completely right. I think, though, I do believe that he changes the view of what a mythology can and should be in philosophy of art, along the lines of a stronger concept of philosophy, a philosophy of reason. There aren't really any limits to reason in the identities system, which there quite apparently are in 1800. I think he's dissatisfied with these limitations of philosophy in 1800, right?
Any further questions? Maybe we have 2 more minutes for questions before we take a 5-minute break. Well, I will ask a question then. I will take the privilege as the moderator to ask a final question. So thanks for the talk. I have 2 big questions maybe, but I'll just try to ask them briefly. One is, I'm fascinated by the idea of myth as a kind of intermediary between nature and the I. We can think about myth as telling the story of the I arising out of nature. I'm wondering whether that doesn't privilege maybe particular kinds of myths, like myths that tell the story of the human being arising out of the earth. And then I'm wondering whether those kinds of myths have a central place, but those aren't the only kinds of myths that are told. And so I wonder whether it's too narrow in a certain way, whether it leaves out quite a bit. And I wanted to ask maybe about the connection between the form of myth, the place that it has in the system, and then maybe what particular contents of myths would correspond with that form. And then I was also curious if you had any final reflections on the role of the unconscious, which we've mentioned a few times, especially because the unconscious, if we think of myth as having a kind of unconscious origin, then this also accounts for the experience of mythological consciousness of encountering something that it feels it is not responsible for, that it is subject to. So if you have any thoughts on those. I know it's...
The latter question, I will simply answer with a yes. And I think I didn't really do, in my dissertation that is appearing hopefully this year, this is one of the main concepts, right? That myth, this new myth, has something to do with actuality or as a Wirklichkeit, right? Exactly because of their unconscious origins. You can hit yourself on these myths, right? They pose limitations on the subject. So I think you're completely right. And to your other question, yes, I think Schelling privileges myths that are bound somehow to nature, at least regarding these philosophical myths. If we turn back to his early dissertation, he would, though, expand the notion of myth and say, no, we also have historical myths of all different kinds, right?
Yeah.
And in this category comes fables and so on and so forth.
Excellent.
But philosophical myth, I think he's privileging myths that has to do with human and nature. Yes.
Great.
So
okay, thanks so much for answering that in like 1 minute. That was a very good 1 minute answer. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Go get yourself a cup of tea or a snack or something, and we'll be back with Aman's talk. Okay, about 5 minutes. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Is my volume good? Let me check that really quickly on the break here. Okay.
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
And again, I apologize. I double and triple checked the time difference and then
No
messed with the
problem.
date. So
Yeah, it's no problem. And I know it's really early for you, so my apologies for that. And yeah, I'm just glad that you're here and
yeah, me too.
and that we're all ready for you. So
Great.
and, we could have just shuffled it around otherwise anyway. So no
That
big
makes
deal.
sense. But I appreciate the flexibility.
Yeah. So I think it's 5:45. So I think we can go ahead and get started here. So I want to briefly introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Professor Amin Allred. He is the associate professor at the University of Toledo in Ohio. Is that right? Is that where
Yep.
you are? Okay,
That's
good.
great.
There's in Ohio. He has interest in phenomenology, 19th and 20th century, continental philosophy, aesthetics, and other areas. And today we're going to hear a talk entitled Monotheism or Mythology in German Idealism. So the floor is yours. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. And I'll try to, like a lot of these talks, I think it's on the longer end, so I'm going to try to summarize some parts of it because I'm going to try to do some comparative work. This is going to be, to a certain degree, superficial on any one particular thinker, but we can talk about and sort of go into more depth on any particular points as we go. But my goal here is to try to really do some very basic work introducing a discourse about mythology and German idealism from Kant to Hegel, Schelling, and ideally Hölderlin, although in this version in the 30 minutes we won't get that far, unfortunately. One thing, so to anticipate the way in which Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin will use mythology, it is important to stipulate that mythology will be treated here as inherently polytheistic. When dealing with monotheistic discourse that seems to function in ways that are similar to mythology, we will discuss that as revelation or as revealed religion. Now, in the context of this paper, I think that stipulation is justified by the usage that these thinkers themselves follow, although there will be complications, especially with Hölderlin. And while this distinction is contingent, I do think it's hardly arbitrary, since it will function as a crucial index, one, of how monotheism tries to distance itself from polytheism, while two, preserving a space within Western discourse for rational discourse about the monotheistic God that is denied to polytheistic gods. Now, my primary interest in this paper will just be outlining the systematic use to which Kant puts a monotheistic God, and to which Hegel and Schelling, it's like 5:30 in the morning here still, so I apologize. Hegel and Schelling put the tension between a monotheistic God and polytheistic gods within their respective understandings of critical philosophy. So my focus here is really going to be on the places in which these thinkers indicate what a discourse about mythology would do specifically for the ideas of critical or systematic philosophy. I will also indicate places where rhetorically and conceptually this systematic use lines up with what I will treat broadly as nationalistic or colonizing features of that systematic work. Envisioning and developing a globalizing systematic philosophy that privileges the idea of a European or Western tradition, while inextricably weaving together ideas about science, religion, the state, culture, and human biology. The larger project of which this paper is a part takes up these colonizing features in much more depth. Here, my emphasis is on seeing the traces of those features within the debate about systematicity. What I want to suggest is that developing a discourse about mythology in the critical philosophy of German idealism exposes the implication of these colonizing features in the development of reason. While Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin all intimated the revolutionary potential of a mythological discourse within critical philosophy, in the case of Hegel and Schelling, it seems to me that this revolutionary force is ultimately blunted insofar as their maintenance of a unitary teleology still ultimately subordinated polytheism to monotheism. As serious and insightful as both prove to be about mythology, they can ultimately only regard its relevance to critical philosophy as either ancient or unproductively anachronistic. In contrast, Hölderlin tries to develop a mythological modernism, one which truly exposes the critical project to which colonizing discourse insists on regarding as the other of reason. Okay, so I'll move through these sections pretty quickly and try to gloss over some of the more technical parts, but again, I'm happy to talk about them more in the conversation. So Kant, betting, speculating, and striving in Kant, monotheism as an architectonic requirement at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason. So I'll be focusing almost entirely on a couple of sections at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason. Anyone who wants to find a mythology in the opening of Kant's critical philosophy is either 500 years too late or else 20 or so years too early. 500 years too late because that's more or less when the spot where Kant lived his whole life became decisively monotheistic. When the Teutonic Order founded a military fort called Königsberg on the site of what had once been Tvangsta, a settlement of the Old Prussians, against whom the Teutonic Knights were waging what would ultimately prove to be an eminently successful crusade. So successful that the military fort would become the capital of a crusader state that would, through a series of twists and turns, reclaim the name of those it had conquered and become the Kingdom of Prussia, which had a few more name changes ahead of it. And 20 years too early because that's when a group of anonymous students trying their hands as pamphleteers would produce a fragment that purported to have seen a mythology lurking there anyway. Eminently successful crusade notwithstanding. The absence of mythology in Kant is related to the absence of any concern with polytheism. Kant's monotheism is unremarkably ubiquitous. Why would it be otherwise? The great debates about God that he found himself embroiled in, as the cost of demonstrating the safeness of his innovative critical system for German Christendom, tended to pit monotheism against, quote, Spinozistic pantheism, with the subtle hint that such pantheism might conceal, or at least might be allied with, an atheism. While only one position will call itself monotheistic in the narrow sense, all of the sides in this debate are about monotheism in the broader sense of thinking about God as a unity. All the interlocutors in such a debate presume a unity to the idea of God, however much they may disagree about the exact character of that unity, and what it entails with respect to questions about transcendence in the world. And however much they may disagree about the reality of the entity to which the idea refers. In debates about whether there is a God at all, and if there is a God, whether or not that God's nature is to be identified in some way with the world, whose existence reason cannot maintain any serious doubt about, it would just muddy the waters to ask about a polytheism that no one who mattered anyway, seriously maintained. It would be a mistake about the ontology of the kind of being that God was taken to be. Critical philosophy is supposed to concern itself with getting as precise as possible about the meaning of the objects of various mental faculties for rational beings, so as to determine the proper conditions under which judgments about them can be true or not. So while critical theoretical philosophy will be agnostic about the existence of God, it is not at all agnostic about certain properties that God would have to have, and these properties will exclude polytheism as thoroughly as the idea of the world excludes there being multiple worlds in Kant. The idea of God that critical philosophy engages is necessarily monotheistic because the idea of God is architectonic. The ends of such architectonics are by definition unitary. The job of the philosopher is to write the monogram of the unity of sciences. This is gloss on Kant. Of course, a philosopher in this sense is not possible for Kant. The very thing that makes the philosopher the legislator of human reason, that they are deriving ends directly from the operation of reason without waiting for empirical verification, makes Kant hesitant to call anyone truly such a philosopher, since in his own preceding Titanic monograph, Kant had shown that such empirical verification would never come, not making the faith of the philosopher absurd or nonsensical, as later positivists would hold, but making the work of the philosopher depend upon an infinite amount of patience. But while the realization of such an idea always recedes asymptotically, we can with less modesty claim some rather decent approximations of it. This sudden shift to the rhetoric of cosmopolitanism in Kant, while understandable in Kant's philosophy generally, may seem odd. But Kant is anticipating the higher ends that he's about to set philosophy to, where the two highest parts of the system of metaphysics, which has retained from the opening of the Critique of Pure Reason its claim not merely to be the highest part of philosophy, but of all the sciences. So this is in the section in Kant, at the end of the critique on rational cosmology and rational theology. Throughout the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant will repeatedly treat theological questions as unanswerable from the standpoint of theoretical reason, while continuing to assert the normative necessity of working in the hopes of answering them. It would be irresponsible to bet, and that's Kant actually uses a variation on that word, on the existence of God, or to use the existence of God as a sort of premise or a bit of seed money, that's my metaphor there, in a system of speculation, but it is equally necessary to treat it as a moral imperative, a belief that demands labor, a belief that must be striven for even without any guarantee of success. Work out your salvation, if not in fear and trembling, at least with sufficient modesty, and without making your belief depend upon some false hope. Nor is the laborious work of critique likely to be merely negative, even if it doesn't secure its ultimate end. While Kant's repeated appeals to the rhetoric of modesty and the demands for an unfulfillable labor always fall short of the realization of a rational theology, they bear much more fruit with respect to rational cosmology, the unity of the world, and the fruitfulness of treating the world as susceptible to rational investigation are, of course, major themes of the critique of pure reason, and their investigation is explicitly the task of the cosmopolitan philosopher. The crucial thing to note is that in this cosmopolitanism, this attempt to knit the world into a systematic whole, we see what profit can be derived from treating the world as a closed totality that always asymptotically approaches the idea of a God, whose unity is required as an architectonic principle. This complicated rhetorical gesture of continually asserting that one must have a faith in God as a normative ideal, which, while largely moral, has both practical and theoretical ramifications, hence the need for a metaphysics of morals, while refusing to engage in any speculation, that is, refusing to use the existence of God to supply any premises for the sciences, and while engaging in a rhetoric of modesty, entails a critique of the applicability of revealed religion to critical philosophy as well. Whether this amounts to a critique of revealed religion as such is, of course, a much broader question that I won't go into. Even when discussing this proper idea of God, that is to say, unitary, transcendent, rational creator of the world, philosophy cannot avail itself of any propositions derived from revealed religion. This prohibition against treating revealed religion philosophically, coupled with the necessary monotheism of the critical system, will make the idea of discovering a discourse about mythology within critical philosophy doubly absurd. No story about God, much less the gods. It is precisely because it lacks any positive revelatory doctrinal or dogmatic power, even with respect to monotheism, that Kant affirms the necessity of metaphysics. Not merely to faith or belief in God, but to religion. Earlier, Kant had referred to this negative work of reason as, quote, the discipline of reason, and had curiously contrasted discipline from culture. Where culture, quote, merely produces a skill or a form of knowledge, would be my gloss on that, discipline involves the use of a, quote, compulsion through which the constant propensity to stray from certain rules is limited and finally eradicated. There, as at the opening of the Transcendental doctrine and method, Kant had noted that such strict discipline is often held in distaste by reason and cognition, as they are to the seductions of culture. And I apologize for my cat there, who has a few things to say too. At the end of the Transcendental doctrine and method, we are in a position to see that this jealousy had in fact always been the solicitude of a lover for its beloved, which again is Kant's own metaphor there. While the rhetoric here most often seems to function through admittedly rather attenuated sexual or romantic imagery, I think it fits just as well in the development of the account in this section to understand this as being like the covenant of love described between God and his people in the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. The cosmopolitan philosopher who demurs from identifying their self-legislating activity with that of the divine rational legislature, whose reason and will they asymptotically approach, nonetheless love and reconcile with an abashed, unfaithful reason, just as God reconciles with a community of repentant idolaters. This helps to shed light on the return at the very end of the Critique of Pure Reason to the language of culture, where syncretic, additive, non-critical culture's promiscuity and idolatry have pushed reason to its most profound alienation in an extrinsic world. Metaphysics, properly chastened by the discipline of critique, is now in a position to be called, quote, the culmination of a culture of human reason, end quote. The work that critique had done without respite is now in a position to, quote, fly with its own wings, which, of course, Kant loves that metaphor and uses it a lot in his philosophy. And so it's fascinating that here at the end he says reason is now in that position, a metaphor for the achievement of transcendence that up to now has been denied reason. That's as far as I'm going to Kant. I'm going to go through the next section. I'm going to talk about the oldest system program. I'm going to try to summarize that a little more quickly. I hope that people are pretty familiar with that, and I'm not doing anything there that I think is super would be sort of surprising to anybody. So I'll try to gloss through that section a little more quickly. Around 20 years later, the authors of the oldest system program of German idealism will use similar metaphors in their attempt to stage a coup within reason's regime. Where Kant had seen a hard-won unity between the laborious work of critique and the ability of reason to finally let the metaphysics fly, these authors reject this seeming patience as tedium. And here's a quote: "Here I will descend to the field of physics. The question is this: how should a world be constituted for a moral being? I should like to give our physics, progressing laboriously with experience, wings again." Specifying what this is meant is how this fits within with the author's opening complaint that Kant has supplied only an example, not a true system of morality, or how the author envisions getting around Kant's critique of using faith and morality as anything more than bulwarks for religion. Now, I'm going to assume here that this could be, I'm not going to take a stance on who authored it. I'm going to assume that it could be the work of any of them or a collective of either Hegel, Schelling, or Hölderlin, entirely, and precisely because my main concern here is going to see how it opens up possibilities that Hegel and Schelling will much later in their lives take up. And so for that extent, sort of nailing down the details of the fragment is not as important to me as sort of making it a sort of a set of possibilities that they would all surely be aware of and have been thinking about. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a bit here. So famously, right, they take Kant's sort of much more regal metaphors, a point that's been remarked on in the Critique of Pure Reason, and instead employ explicitly and radically democratic metaphors. This is linked up with them saying, quote, that the philosopher must possess just as much aesthetic power as the poet. And that also then that the self-legislator is going to be in some way poetic. So that, of course, is already a significant departure from Kant, but it's important to bear in mind that the authors envision it as a necessary consequence of moving just one step beyond Kant's analysis. The authors do seem, at this point at least, to implicitly agree with Kant that the ideas of God and the world are supplied by reason and cannot be actualized through any empirical experience. Blah, blah, blah. But where Kant takes this inadequacy in the direction of a strict iconoclasm, no doctrines that depend on revealed religion, and then mythology, right? These guys are going to take it in, of course, in a more speculative direction. So they're not going to censure syncretic culture the same way. And the authors are explicit where this innovation lies. So this is near the end. Quote, "Monotheism of reason in the heart, polytheism of imagination in art. This is what we need." So this is the first invocation that there is a place for polytheism in what they will explicitly call a mythology of reason. At this point, mythology is posited as aesthetic, as the discourse through which the, quote, polytheism of imagination in art is effectuated. But even if it is posited as a form of monotheism, insofar as it becomes reasonable to the philosopher, it must also somehow be compatible with the monotheism of the heart, the metaphysical moral unity that we saw at the core of Kant's system. So unsurprisingly, the fragment doesn't resolve this tension in a systematic way. And in the last half here, and I know I've got about 15 minutes left, so I'll try to move pretty quickly. Is that right? Yeah, okay. I'll try to move pretty quickly. And if I'm wrong about that, just let me know and I'll stop sooner. I'm going to try to describe ways in which in some of their more mature works, Hegel and Schelling try to do so. Again, this is going to be sort of very brief indications, but I'm happy to talk about it more. So I'm going to be looking at Hegel's lectures on aesthetics and Schelling's historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology. So in both cases, among the last works that they wrote, although they're still about 30 years apart from one another. Quick notes. Again, I would like to go into more depth on this, but I'm not going to here. Two things to consider that I think are really important as we look at these have to do with sort of the state of knowledge when Hegel and Schelling are writing. So much more than when Kant is writing, Hellenism and Orientalism are going to deeply inform the discourse of Hegel and Schelling. The German Academy is developing a huge interest in Orientalism at the same time that Hegel and Schelling are writing. of course, that discourse is incredibly complicated and both trying to open up Europe to non-European ideas in ways that are itself very problematic. I just want to sort of reference that as we think about that here, that this work is taking place in the backdrop of academic work in Orientalism being done by their colleagues, and that informs them in various ways. The other, and I think this is sort of more crucial here, is one of the things that I find fascinating about both Hegel and Schelling's account is we're sort of seeing some of the last descriptions of history prior to the discovery of what sometimes gets called deep time. This is especially true in Schelling, whose lecture comes out in 1852, but sort of was a version of lecture that he's giving in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So right as there's more and more discoveries geologically of the depth of world history, and that's going to sort of, I think, make this text really interesting. Schelling is up to date on the latest science, but it's just at the start of this sort of impact that deep time will have on how we think about history. And similarly, in the absence of, but also the development of what we would now call textual criticism. Even in the critical work, Hegel and Schelling are going to take the truth, the sort of the testamentary truth that there sort of is an uncomplicated history to the text of Homer, Hesiod, and the Bible, much more for granted than contemporary scholars would. But again, they're writing right as this is changing, and I find that sort of shift really sort of fascinating and important. I'm just going to sort of footnote those two things for now, though. Okay, Hegel, just really quick treatments of Hegel and Schelling. Again, not nearly as much depth as they deserve, but just to try to get some ideas on the table. So the authors of the Old System program had allied mythology with poetry and aesthetics, calling for it to, quote, make philosophy sensuous. In his lectures on aesthetics, Hegel takes up this connection between the sensuous and mythology. He defines the task of art, considered from the standpoint of the spiritual development of humanity, as the sensuous presentation of the ideal. And it moves towards increasingly refined and abstract forms of sensibility. In this way, a large portion of the aesthetics tells the story of how collectively expanding our capacities of sensibility and the imagination extends the ability of spirit by seeing itself, first in the natural world, but increasingly in new inner moral worlds. Hegel's treatment of art continues the pedagogical orientation of the Old System program. It's going to do so, and it's going to do so by explicitly by representing the divine, which is the guide leitmotif of the entire 1,500 or so page aesthetics. The idea of the nation here is the crucial notion, and it's translating the German word Volk. The English translations tend to say nation. The reason why I bring that up is that in Schelling, he's going to talk a lot about people. Again, the German there is Volk, but it gets translated in English differently. Just for the sake of ease, I'm going to use the English, but I want to just remark that that is, of course, the same word in both cases. Blah, blah, blah. So the entire presentation of the supersensuous world is going to depend on the idea of the nation. That is to say, the world of a specific people or nation. A major way in which the ideal presents itself is through the various figures of the divine. By seeing how these nations develop their gods, we will see how they understand themselves and how they are increasingly free moral and spiritual development in comparison to the external world. This is the key idea in Hegel. Through the particular powers and actions of their specific gods, the universal, undifferentiated natural world gives way to one of many determinate, particularized national worlds. Despite the fact that he talks about these determinate, particular nationalized worlds, it still remains the case that the Greek polytheism is exemplary. Hegel takes the polytheistic art of the Greek world, more or less identical to its mythology on his account, to be the most adequate expression of the relationship between the natural and spiritual world. By positing an identity between the external natural world and the world of free play, Greek polytheism represents the most perfect expression of the world-building possibilities of art. We see this particularly clearly in classical sculpture, which represents the idealized human body as itself divine. So this perfect convergence of humanism and polytheism represents the apotheosis of the presentation of the divine and forms the high water mark that Hegel takes the form of classical art to be. But this is also true in the epic. Hegel, of course, loves Herodotus' claim that Homer and Hesiod gave the Greeks their gods. But he doesn't. It doesn't mean that they invented their gods whole cloth. I'm going to come back to this very briefly when I talk about Schelling in a second. Rather, he takes it to mean that they shaped the gods that were already known in their world into a specifically Greek form by shaping them into a determinate, coherent pantheon. So world building, in other words, turns out to be nation building as well. There's some sort of ancient, quote, foreign, which is Hegel's word there, culture, and it gets domesticated in the context of sculpture and epic. And that's also where its failure for Hegel will arise. Despite the perfection of Greek polytheism for Hegel, and again, I'm going to sort of summarize briefly here, it falls apart on the notion of fate. Fate can only provide a weak negative unity to this pantheon. And of course, it's only going to be, but that presupposes some sort of unity that will again only be realized in monotheistic Christianity. And so that again ends up being privileged. Okay, really quickly on Schelling. Again, I apologize that I'm running through things quickly here. So the two main features of Hegel's account of mythology that I've wanted to emphasize: the treatment of Greek polytheism as fundamentally more determinate than other polytheisms, and the choice to understand Greek art as the principal site of Greek world formation are both denied in Schelling's treatment of mythology. So I think pretty explicitly, Schelling sees Hegel's treatment here as lacking in his 1842 lectures. From the beginning of the lectures, Schelling insists that his goal is to offer a general theory of mythology. And while this account of that theory shares many of the same evaluative forms of cultural chauvinism as Hegel's, it is crucial to Schelling's systematic philosophy that all mythologies are equally valid mythologies. I think this shows up in Schelling's, in the context of Schelling, in the last question that Gregory had asked in the previous talk, because there Schelling will want to say that he's trying to have a theory that accounts for any myth about anything to a certain degree, right? Whether it's about humans, about the human's place in nature, or about sort of an explanation of the ideological myth. In fact, that's going to be crucial to how he ends up at the answer that what mythology is the history of the world of the gods, because he thinks that any other answer would limit the scope of what myth can be. So notice there the history of the world of the gods. Again, it's essential that mythology is polytheistic, even though a large chunk of Schelling's lectures are devoted to monotheistic stories, which might look mythological, but which Schelling treats primarily as forms of revealed religion, and that seems to be, in his case, actual history. To anticipate one wrinkle, Schelling says that this actual history given in revealed religion has some of the properties of mythology, while at the same time not being mythology. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have the time to get too much into this here, but this is one of the sort of the key puzzles that I find there. Schelling has this long discourse about mythology, but if you look at the specific myths he deals with there, the main myth he deals with is the Tower of Babel, which he treats and explicitly as revealed religion, and which he also seems to take as actually historical. So it's kind of fascinating that in this text that's trying to be about the world of the gods, a specific story about a monotheistic God that Schelling endorses more or less ends up being crucial here. Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to skip over the connection between Schelling and Hegel, where Schelling doesn't privilege the Greeks in the same way. He does, though, in one important way, and this is going to sort of where I'm going to try to end in a second. Schelling does join Hegel in giving spirit a special privilege to the Greeks in at least two ways. Although Schelling denies that Homer and Hesiod gave the Greeks their gods, he does assert that Greek polytheism and Greek mythology are particularly suited to free creation by artists within the world of the gods. That is, he ascribes to the entirety of the Greek world a freedom with respect to their gods that he denies other groups. This freedom is going to be crucial in allowing Schelling to ascribe a special role to the Greeks in the systematic development of a, quote, modern philosophical world. But on the ontological level, crucially for Schelling, there's no difference. Like Hegel, Schelling equates the origins of the gods with the origin of a people. So insofar as the category of the name of the people or nation proves to be essential for a theory of systematic philosophy, then it becomes necessary for a systematic philosophy to account for how various worlds are revealed as the worlds of gods. But whereas for Hegel these revelations are creative, they are for Schelling, they're the response to a historical event. It's worth noting the way in which Schelling interprets polytheism as being primarily a historical event are consonant with the approaches to Christianity each seems to take at the end of their lives. I'm not going to wade into the complicated question of their religion, but and whether even Hegel remains meaningful Christian, but it will simply note that it is relatively uncontroversial for us to attest that at this point, Hegel's Christianity or post-Christianity was much more consistent with the development of secular civil society, whereas Schelling's became increasingly, for lack of a better word, orthodox. What is clear is that, operating from very different conceptions about what monotheism entailed to critical philosophy, both still seem to privilege some version of monotheism in modern critical and speculative philosophy. So I know I'm like at a minute or two in time, so I'm going to just try to really quickly summarize some brief conclusions that I can talk about more. So where does this end up? Well, crucially, and this is the thing that I found fascinating, the reason why I went back to monotheism when I was working on Schelling, Schelling's account, despite trying to privilege mythology in the lectures, ends up turning entirely on the mythical story of Genesis, which he will refuse to call myth. He'll call it revealed religion. And it was this distinction between myth and revealed religion that I found so fascinating. Specifically, it'll sort of orient itself around the Tower of Babel, which, as I said, he seems to still treat as kind of a quasi-historical story, which is it seems even more odd to us. But remember at the time that even sort of secular and atheistic accounts of history didn't yet have a deep sense of deep time. And so this idea of the origin of people was sort of imagined even by purely secular scholars on a much more abbreviated time frame, which I think is crucial in understanding the way that Schelling is going to put that story to use. This is also going to end up being, and again, I don't have time to discuss this in depth, this is going to end up bleeding very heavily into Schelling's endorsement of a theory of biological racism, which is problematic. So the Tower of Babel ends up developing both linguistic, cultural, and racial difference, again, as a sort of a quasi-historical event. I have a lot more to say about that, but I'm not here. In terms of Schelling's story, the crucial thing is going to be this. He's going to develop two series side by side. The big question about the diversity of polytheism is going to come down to him for pantheons. So on the one hand, you've got the sequence Uranos, Kronos, Zeus, and on the other hand, you've got the sequence Elohim, Yahweh, and the Trinity, the Christian Trinity. Both of these trinities reveal sort of a historical difference that privileges Greek and Hebrew forms of, quote, mythology and revealed religion. And that's sort of where the account of systematic philosophy will come in. So mythology ends up then playing a crucial role in the development of systematic thinking, but it still ends up being entirely ancient. And in Hegel's explicit, it would be anachronistic to bring into the modern world. The key thing that the Greeks do is allow that development of the monotheistic trajectory to continue alongside it. A lot more to say there, but I do know that I'm about out of time, so I'm just going to leave it really quickly at the conclusion. Looked at it this way, I think we're in a position to see where Hegel and Schelling's interest in mythology might pose interesting problems to the form of hegemony in modern history that locates itself in Europe, and that takes a story about Christianity, whiteness, and the Enlightenment as a frame for its ideological justification of domination. The very move that Kant uses to highlight what the culture of reason is picks out the movement of exclusion that will be crucial to insisting on the specialness or uniqueness of the European project. Viewed from this perspective, the old system program could have gone in either direction. We can see it as pro-Eurocentric or anti-Eurocentric. Part of its revolutionary nature could have been to insist that in the world of myth and mythology and polytheism, which world the authors claimed the people had never left, there remained the imminent possibility of a form of free creation that philosophy was unaware of. In this way, there could have been an invitation for philosophy to dissociate itself from European hegemonic project by mythologizing itself. On the other hand, it could develop in a way where mythology sort of gives us the prehistory of the history of reason. And I think that, again, just to sort of summarize briefly, I think that in Hegel and Schelling, you see that tension is never resolved. This desire to sort of open up this radical possibility of mythology never fully breaks with this idea of treating it as a prehistory of reason. I think Hölderlin's more interesting, but that would take us even more afield. So I hope that at least gives the basic ideas of what I'm trying to work on. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much for your talk. It's my virtual clap and my clap there. Yeah, thanks for giving the talk and getting up so early to share your paper with us. So I really appreciate it. Okay, so we have time for questions, and it's about 6:20. So how about we can take at least 10 minutes, maybe a little more for questions. So if you have questions, just raise your virtual hand or send me your name in the chat. Okay, Dennis.
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you missed Greg's talk, I guess.
I did. I apologize. Yeah.
It's sort of interesting because Greg ended with this sort of call for a return to myth. But what I got from Greg's talk as well is this sort of, I guess, Schelinian move to sort of take the Christian myth as the archetype. So then when Greg says return to myth, what I think he's actually saying is a sort of, not really a return to myth, but it's sort of an attempt at sneaking in Christianity again through the background, right? So I'm kind of wondering, I'm really interested in this topic of colonization that you mentioned, and especially with Greg's idea of the return to myth in mind. I'm more interested in how could we, according to you, decolonize myth? Are you attempting to decolonize myth? Are you giving a sort of genealogy of myth, like Foucauldian style, or is that your
so I apologize. Yeah, I feel very bad that I missed it. Again, I messed up my time zone, so I hope I can hear more about it later. But that's great if there's, and if Greg wants to jump in, I would be more than happy to hear his thoughts on this also. Really quickly on me, yeah, I mean my long goal is to sort of try to think about a decolonization of the idea of myth. So for me specifically, I'm fascinated, especially by the ways in which these folks are flirting with polytheism. And I'm interested in the way in which, even in the trajectory, I wrote my dissertation way back when on Heidegger, and so that's sort of where I come at Schelling through that lens. Even though folks like Heidegger supposedly are breaking with monotheism, I don't think Heidegger does. I think that monotheism remains normative in most European thinking after the Enlightenment, so that monotheism remains sort of a privileged target even of secular thinking. And I think that is tied together to the way in which both Christian monotheism and Enlightenment atheism tend to end up I think that there's a way in which that ends up allowing both of them to sort of participate together in a form of cultural hegemony that I think could potentially in some ways be disrupted if we looked at elements of polytheistic thinking that remain active in the quote-unquote Western tradition, which I think Hölderlin pretty explicitly tried to do in his later work, and which Schelling and Hegel sort of flirt with, but I don't see that break happening fully. So yeah, I mean, I do think that in Schelling there still is a privilege of Christian myth, which I think he hesitates to call myth. He sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. I'm especially looking at the places where he doesn't, right? But he still, even when he calls it revealed religion, he does give it a privileged role in understanding what myth is. I think that points to a real tension in his thinking that I think he doesn't productively resolve. But that's sort of the short answer. I apologize I missed the talk. Greg, if you want to jump in,
no, it's fine. I don't want to take up your time. I just want to thanks, Dennis, for bringing up. No, I'm not trying to sneak in Christianity through the back door. I'm overtly introducing it. So I think it's pretty overt. My Christian references they're not hidden or through the back door. They're through the front door. But that introduction to the front door is really actually undermining. I mean, in the talk, actually, I wasn't following Schelling's distinction between myth and revealed religion. And actually, my mythologizing Christianity is actually undermining that distinction that Schelling draws. So this is also, in my own ideas, are also an invitation to kind of move beyond the way Schelling makes the distinction. Although I'm not thinking of it so much in terms of decolonization, and in some ways there are some overlaps and interconnections with what I think Elmon is referring to. But yeah, I don't want to take up any more of the time, but it's a really interesting set of questions and topics. So thanks, Dennis, for asking it. Yeah. Okay, other questions for Elmon here? We have some little bit of time. I have a whole list here, but I don't want to take it all up myself. Okay, Dennis wants to come back. Okay, floor is yours.
Yeah, just again about decolonization. You mentioned this interesting discovery of deep time, I think you called it. So is even today, that's what I'm wondering. Is this concept of deep time also a way to decolonize myth?
That's a good question. So I think, so specifically there I'm referring to, so what I'm trying to refer to there, and I went too quickly, is that, the time frame that Hegel and Schelling are imagining myth unfolding on is a couple of thousands of years, right? Which we know now to be wildly inadequate. And that's important because, for Schelling especially, so since Schelling endorses something like, and again, I don't want to get into sort of the twists and turns of his Christianity because they're many and varied. But by the time he's writing the lectures on mythology, he seems to sort of endorse a pretty historical version of the Christian mythos. So therefore, there was a unified people, and that unified people dispersed and scattered, and that's crucial to the way that the lecture is structured. And he has to imagine that taking place on the time frame of a couple thousand years. That might sort of really demarcate him from a scientific understanding of people, except for that at the time, even sort of, even more secular scholars of these questions tended to think of this taking place in the context of a couple thousand years also. And so you had to sort of have this way of describing radical shift without reference to sort of the huge time frames that we have. And I do think that those huge time frames end up decentering these kinds of stories in ways that we still don't fully appreciate. And I think, I've gotten really interested in the context of this and sort of what we know about sort of early human archaeology and anthropology. And, our understanding of that is changing rapidly right now. But the big part of the answer is we still don't know a lot, right? But I think that we're in a position now where we can say, where we don't have to imagine a unitary beginning to the stories of myth. I actually think that works much better for Schelling's insights because this allows, he has to sort of have a theory where the histories of the peoples of the gods is a story of dispersal. So the only way to have difference is through dispersal. I do think that the idea of deep time, and as we understand more and more about sort of the origins of humans specifically and human society, we're in a position, I think, to start to ask the question, what would it mean to take seriously the originary difference of these sorts of stories, right? That the kinds of time frames we're talking about allow wildly different stories about the gods, and it's sort of reflections of sort of our understandings about what the world is, to emerge, in different places in ways that interact over, tens of thousands of years rather than over hundreds or 1,000 years.
Okay, thanks. Any final comments, Dennis? Do you want to reply, or is that okay?
No, great. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Originary difference, very good. Thanks.
Okay, other questions? We have a few minutes. Okay, yeah, Jesper, please.
Thank you. Just a thought, because Schelling in his Tübinger-Studien, I didn't really mention this, but he, of course, also considers Christianity a myth. He counts the Bible as myth in the early works. And what about originary identities? I mean, there are similar structures, and also to follow up on Michael's question of absolute identity, are there also identities there? Just thought.
Yeah, I mean, so probably. So yeah, I mean, so yeah. So I think that I was focusing on that one lecture precisely because I think the difference between history and revealed religion and mythology is sharp there. But you're right. In other places, it's much less sharp. And of course, in the Tübingen at that time, Schelling had a much different relationship to Christianity, also, which I think sort of, and that gets really complicated. But yeah, I don't want to sort of rule out identity, but I think my appeal here to sort of something like originary difference does is it allows Schelling to liberate this idea. So yeah, I think that there are sort of broad commonalities. I also think that there's lots of ways in which sort of cultures interact with one another that we don't have sort of a good theory of yet. I do think that the role that identity plays in Hegel and Schelling ends up privileging this systematic move in a similar way. It doesn't mean that I want to reject the idea of identity, though. So I'm not trying to sort of have a hard metaphysical or ontological thesis here, but just see ways in which sort of liberating that sort of loosening that sort of Christian Christocentric narrative would open up sort of possibilities to sort of expand on some ambiguities that remain in Hegel and Schelling.
Yeah, please. Yes, Bert.
Short follow-up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I agree. And I'm asking myself, because of course, in the current project, I'm doing Alexander von Humboldt's Cosmos, and he's saying that he briefly just comments that that the expansion of our knowledge of the world, that is the expansion of experiences, also the expansions of our knowledge about other cultures, affects ourselves. That is, moves back on our own worldviews and changes them, alters them. And he says, because we see that they are somehow identical to us. That it is not because they're different, because if they were absolutely different, of course we would have no idea. It would be not even be persons or shapes or forms. It would be nothing, probably, I don't know. And he says, because we expand our world, and of course he's thinking of himself, Alexander von Humboldt, right? We see they are different, but also that they are that they're similar to us. There's structural similarities that changes our view of the world. It relativates, so to speak, Christianity, he says.
Yeah, I don't know Humboldt well enough, so I will have to look into that. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that, but yeah. So.
Very interesting comments and questions. Further questions or comments? We can take a couple more minutes before we take a 10-minute break.
But yeah, I mean, yeah. So, but please send me the info on Humboldt, because that is exactly the questions, sort of the questions that I'm interested in now. Right? Is sort of where does cultural relativism, where does sort of this new interest in Germany at the time in culture end up sort of opening up to a real pluralism? Where does it end up sort of opening up to forms of colonialism? I don't think there's a unified answer to that question. So yeah, I think that it's sort of an open question. And that's sort of what I'm really interested in. So I'd love to see the references in Humboldt that you're talking about, and think about it more. Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone else? Well, I will take the opportunity to ask a question. So one thing that I wanted to ask, this is a point that came up briefly when you were talking about das Volk, or the nation, or the people, is the way that you see this in Schelling, but I think you mentioned it in connection to Hegel, that myth is thought of as somehow formative of community. Mm-hmm. Right? And it's interesting when I read, like, for example, Durkheim. And Durkheim talks about how actually we're supposed to go the other way. He says we're supposed to understand myth through community rather than community through myth. And this is something Ernst Cassirer, he critiques Durkheim and takes Schelling's position and says we should approach community through myth. Myth is formative for community. It's not that we have a community already and then we become, and then we somehow go to myth, but it goes the other way. I'm curious if you think, what you think about this kind of question, or if you have any thoughts about this, the direction of understanding in this.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of fall on the Schelling side too. I think in Hegel, so the move that I was looking at in Hegel, and this is mostly sort of in the aesthetic lectures, if I had more time to sort of go into it, which I do elsewhere, it's mostly in the discussion of epic and in the discussion of sculpture. And so these are specific moments, right? Yes. Obviously, Hegel's treatment, myth, art, aesthetics, sort of have multiple interventions in history. But I do think that in the context of systematic philosophy, these interventions end up sort of being privileged in various ways. Mm-hmm. And in both cases, it seems Hegel wants to sort of unsurprisingly imagine a double move there. So myth is originary of a people qua people for Hegel. Yeah. So what he sees in myth, and whether or not this sort of is reflective of our understandings of these things, that's a much longer question. But he takes something like the story of the Odyssey and the Iliad here, especially, right? So Homer is part of this oral tradition, and that oral tradition is synthesizing a bunch of quote unquote foreign, which is the word that Hegel used there, cultures. And Hegel, and then what Homer does is he packages that together into something that's uniquely Greek. And in fact, by doing so, doesn't just give, so the sort of the gloss on Herodotus, he's not just giving the Greeks their gods, he's giving the Greeks their nation. Now, were the Greeks a nation in the sense that Hegel meant it? Probably not. That's fine. But crucially there, Hegel's trying to sort of say that is doing that sort of identity forming work. But it's doing that identity forming work by taking previous chunks of identity and sort of mixing them together, and then explicitly making them autochthonic. So imagining them as properly belonging always to that place.
Interesting. Thanks a lot for the answer. It's 6:35. I think maybe we should take a break now. So thanks a lot for the talk and for everyone's questions. Great discussion. And I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks again. Okay, hello everybody. I think it's time to get started. Okay, so we're all here. Most important, our speaker is here. Our next speaker is Deborah Casewell. And I believe she is still a Humboldt postdoctoral research fellow at University of Bonn. This is true, this is still your position. Good. She has a wide range of interests, from German idealism to philosophy of religion, Nietzsche, Simone Weil, Eberhard Jungel. There's a lot of interest in 19th and 20th century philosophy. She has a book coming out, I believe, called Monotheism and Existentialism, right? Which is coming out with Cambridge this year.
It's actually out already.
It's already out. Okay, so
yeah.
I obviously
no worries.
Wow, already out. Great. So go out and buy it or go out and read it. Yeah. So obviously I haven't gotten to it yet, but I do plan to. So your talk today is rewriting mythology, tautology, ontology in the novel. So please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm also going to mispronounce tautology about 500 times. I seem to be unable to say that word whatsoever, so please bear with me while I do this. This paper is going to be a bit more, the paper I sent in is a bit more detailed. This is going to argue more for a new understanding of truth and fiction using the ontology and categories of tautology. Again, I can't pronounce that word, just bear with me. In Schelling's late mythology, picking up on some things he says in his early philosophy of art as well. So it's about trying to kind of like look at what he says and see if we can bring it into conversations about the way in which we understand truth and fiction. Because despite the best efforts of Plato, literature has been seen as a particularly effective means by which to convey and explore philosophical concepts. Literature, and in particular the novel, took on a particular importance for both Romanticism's turn to culture and German idealism's aesthetic and cultural engagements. Kierkegaard's philosophy communicates itself as well in various ways through literary forms, and the works of Dostoevsky were essential to this development of existentialism, which itself disseminated its ideas to literature. But harking back to Plato's concerns, philosophical engagement with literature has often concerned the way in which truth is communicated through fiction, and both the opportunities and the perils thereof. That concern with truth then turns towards questions of use. Should literature make us better people, open our eyes to more experiences, broaden our horizons, or does it do the opposite? And so I'm interested in approaching the question of the truth of literature and of the novel from a slightly different perspective, through a reconsideration of Schelling's aesthetics in light of the ontology of his late philosophy and its emphasis on mythology. And that different perspective then, I think, can be used to change the debate about philosophy's relationship to literature. Schelling's concern with mythology was a continual one, and his fullest explorations of it come at two particular points of his career. The Philosophie der Kunst lectures, originally delivered in Jena in 1802-3, and in the 1842 Einführung in die Philosophie der Mythologie, alongside the series Philosophie der Mythologie und die Philosophie der Offenbarung. The earlier lectures on art are based on his Naturphilosophy and stand with an Identitätssystem, whereas the later lectures advance new, more fractious ontology. In the later lectures, Schelling notes that his articulation of mythology there has an impact on his previous understandings of aesthetics, although he largely only briefly negatively reformulates aspects of his further thought in these lectures. In the later lectures, Schelling will also advance a particular understanding of truthfulness, that of tautology, or tautology, again, never mind. Whilst it has been noted that Schelling's discussion of mythology and the symbol in his Philosophie der Kunst prefigures his account of tautology in Philosophie der Mythologie, there has not been much work done in reading these two works in dialogue with each other. And I'm arguing that the shifts and changes in Schelling's thought open up productive new avenues for how to understand truth in both form and content. And this paper takes up this task in one particular case that Schelling sees as particularly able to communicate mythology in its particular truth, that of the novel. And so to explore how the novel can communicate the truth of mythology and how that will and can shift, I'm going to first briefly outline Schelling's understanding of mythology in the Philosophie der Kunst, bringing out in particular his use of symbol and its relation to philosophy and myths. Secondly, I'm going to explore how the novel is particularly able to communicate the truth of mythology, and how the novelist as creator is able to rewrite and reshape myth in order to capture the totality of a world in which they live. And finally, I will end with a discussion of how Schelling's late philosophy presents us with a new way in which to understand the truth novel as tautogorical, and the impact of that new understanding on how to understand the truth of fiction. So Schelling's aesthetics are primarily concerned with how philosophy and art communicate the absolute. Unlike in Hegel, art is not a step along the way to knowledge of the absolute idea. Instead, it and philosophy express the absolute. And in doing so, Schelling outlines two related concepts, mythology and the symbol. And these two complex concepts are at this stage heavily dependent on the naturphilosophy, in which there is this absolute indivisible whole that's posited under various determinations, under various potencies, which are the ideal determinations concerning the inner, essential and inner identity of all things. In perceiving these potencies, we are in fact perceiving the same thing under different conditions, and philosophy manifests these potencies most fully. The absolute or God is produced in three potencies. The third affirms the absolute indifferently and thus ideally, the first finitely and objectively, and the second infinitely and subjectively. As philosophy has as its object the absolute, and the absolute is manifested in nature, history, art, and religion. These are objects of study for philosophy. Through philosophical investigation and practice, we are able to reach the point of indifference, where we are able to know the absolute as one or absolute unity, and this absolute one only in particular form. Philosophy expresses immutably in ideas that which true artistic sensibility actually intuits in the concrete work of art, and can disclose those factors determining genuine artistic judgment. So mythology pertains to both art and philosophy. What ideas are for philosophy, the gods are for art, he says, and these real, objective, living and existing ideas, Schelling writes, are the gods. Mythology is therefore the necessary condition and first content of all art, an expression of these latent creative forces that pervade our existence and describe our situation. And Schelling will write that the gods taken together necessarily constitute a totality, a world. Mythology is not only the content of art, but the condition under which artistic expression can take place. As such, Schelling does not see mythology as a higher language nor as allegory. It is reality in and for itself, simultaneously itself and universal, and therefore it's a symbol. So at this stage, for something to be symbolic, its meaning is simultaneous with its being. Mythology has particular qualities that bring it to the point of indifference, key for the third potence. It cannot be understood as intentional or unintentional, and it's simultaneously meaningless and meaningful, as mythology represents a universal in a particular with absolute indifference. To take a mythological figure, they are seen as the representative of a collective and an individual, a collectivity that is one person. Mythology is therefore the body of ideas that holds together a culture. Schelling's understanding of symbol here prefigures what he will say about tautology in the Einführung, which is the inherence of meaning in being and the union of image and meaning. Mythology is a symbol that is rooted in the real, and the truth is present in it, and not distant or distorted as it would be in allegory and schematization. In how it communicates the absolute, mythology is akin to philosophy in its status as symbolic. The symbolic status of myth follows from Schelling's metaphysical commitments, just as art and philosophy are expressions of the absolute, engaging with it as ideal and real. Myths must be taken at their word because their form is as inviolable as their content. In its presentation of itself, mythology communicates a world. However, Schelling sees that communication is stymied in the contemporary world, which is not as united as it was in Greek mythology. Despite the fragmentation of the world, Schelling sets forth an artistic manifesto that every great poet is called to structure from this evolving mythological world, a world of which his own age can reveal to him only a part. I repeat, from this world he is to structure into a whole that particular part revealed to him, and to create from the content and that substance of that world his mythology. So that genius, the artistic talent, has a particular autonomous creativity, which philosophy can recognize in its godlike freedom is simultaneously the purest and highest necessity. The role of the artist and the purpose of this artistic creativity is to construct a new mythology. And herein lies potential. Artistic creations have a particular symbolic status in how they are able to communicate a world to whatever extent, and therefore they can communicate and create myths. This potentiality pertains in particular to Schelling's discussion of the novel. Having discussed the impossibility of the epic in the current world, Schelling sees that the novel offers a new possibility of communicating the universal through the movement of the finite to the infinite. The novelist is able to enter the medium itself, he says, and to put down the yield of one life and spirit into creation that, the higher they stand, the more they acquire the power of mythology. The novel in particular is particular, it's subjective, but it communicates objectively and universally. Through this movement from the finite to the infinite, it is objective or universally valid only through the form of its portrayal. The novel is able to present the universal in its own particular form, and anticipating the work of Lukács, for example, Schelling sees that the novel should be a mirror of the world, or at least of the age, and thus become a partial mythology. The strength of the novel in Schelling's thought is that it is able to create mythology and be a symbol in a unique way. The creativity involved in writing the novel can create a totality out of a world that is no longer one, and bring the truth of the absolute to humanity through myth as symbol. Therefore, Schelling's philosophy provides a new way in which to consider the novel as a vehicle of philosophical ideas, not allegorically, but at this stage anyway, symbolically. Moving rapidly onwards, however, in Schelling's later philosophy, he distinguishes between positive and negative philosophy. Negative philosophy is a philosophy that sees the absolute or God can be known to the human mind, whereas positive philosophy sees that it is beyond thought. The absolute is instead communicated non-rationally through mythology and revelation, and the task of philosophy is to engage with that particular communication. The ontology of Schelling's late philosophy is quite complex, and I'm sure there are people here who can detail it far better than I can. But what is best to hold in mind here is that the three potences noted earlier shift. Here, the first potence is sheer possibility of the being that must be. It is a pre-ontological drive that allows and even mandates being. It is unrestricted, as ontology that would result from this would be without limits, which would preclude the possibility of particularity. The second potence is termed that which ought not to be, and there's a third potence which limits the second. It allows the second to remain the basis of reality, but through reflection and limitation of freedom, it differentiates it into what can exist as such. In the Einführung, the three potences are articulated as gods, and their theogony plays out in the history of mythology. The move from relative monotheism to polytheism, for example, is a movement from the absolute one to that being deprived of its absoluteness by the second god. And essentially mythology, as a history of the gods, lives through and experiences what philosophy aims to explore. The true God, Schelling sees, can never be captured by knowledge, because that knowledge of that God is always, he says, just knowledge which is coming to be. Because the true God himself is the consciousness, not the existing God, but always the God who is coming to be, who precisely as such is also called the living God, forever just the God who appears, who must be called, always be called to, and captures as an experience, as an appearance is captured. The knowledge of the true God remains thus always a demand. So God always eludes the consciousness, but with a preparation of mythology, the possibility is given for a relationship that will always exceed the terms given. And this impacts on the human mind and on creativity. And so here Schelling sees that humanity is, in his original essence, God establishing nature. Humanity does not know or understand God, or at least not rationally, but posits God and relates to God, even if the coming God will always be beyond the grasp of philosophy. Positive philosophy works with this aspect of human nature and is open to that uncertainty rather than remaining in the confines of mythology and therefore negative philosophy. Mythology and negative philosophy are therefore both truthful but not complete. They stand as preparation, containing within themselves the possibility for further truth found in positive philosophy and in revelation particularly. Now, Schelling's ontological commitments in this new potential era and the position of mythology as theogony give the truth of mythology a different and particular weight. In the preceding section, I noted that myths were symbolic, and what gave myths their symbolic status was their metaphysical ground in the naturphilosophy. Schelling's tautology uses the concept of symbol in the Philosophie der Kunst, where as tautogorical, in myth, meaning and being are one, and content and form, substance and expression may not be distinguished from each other. The ideas are not first present in another form, but come into being only in and thus also at the same time as this form. So tautology is wholly literal. Everything in it is to be understood as it is stated, and thus mythology is not allegorical, it is tautogorical. Here, the tautogorical nature of myth translates it to the experience as well as meaning. Myth is not just a particular form of language, but it's a process through which the consciousness posits and reestablishes God or the absolute. Schelling's understanding of myths as tautogorical in the Einführung must be contextualized with this ontology. Mythology is not only lived through historically, but happens currently in the process of self-consciousness. The warring potencies and the potence that demands but is not grasped are still playing out. And in this situation, humanity continues to posit God in a constant state of preparation. So the tautogorical nature and the stress on mythology shows that Schelling sees that it is myth, not art, that best synthesizes the conscious and the unconscious. Mythology as theogony is also a history of societies as they develop alongside one another. And he sees that a people and a mythology emerge in concert with one another. Mythology becomes a way of explaining how we grasp worldviews non-rationally or unthinkingly, how we accept and assume a worldview shared by a community. There is some freedom in this. The mythology depicts the history and points towards a particular ontological potentiality rather than determining a trajectory. In the discussion of Schelling's Philosophie der Kunst, the creativity that gave rise to the literary art also contained the ability to bring together the world in a totality. It was once the purpose of the artist to create mythology, to patch together the scraps of modernity into a totality once thought impossible, and therefore myths and poetry both communicated as well as created something. In the Einführung, the status of myth in relation to poetry is more complex. For whilst the nature of humanity is God positing, this is not artistic expression, but an ontological demand. Yet in being God positing, humanity is also myth positing. And Schelling notes again that myths give, in the lectures, that myths give rise to poetry, that stories emerge from myths. Poetry's source in mythology is emphasized more strongly here. And he writes that every work of poetry requires some foundation which is independent of it, a basis from which it arises. Nothing can be created simply as poetry plucked pure out of the air. And in literary creation, reality shines through, showing us a meaning in a mirage or in the distance, a meaning, however, which continually escapes us, which we are compelled to pursue without ever being able to reach. It beguiles us, he says, with a whisper of a deeper sense and lures us always further on, without ever declaring itself. The truth in mythology cannot be grasped by the understanding, but it reflects both that which has come and points to that which is to come. So in its then symbolic and now tautogorical status, mythology is negative philosophy, and the God-positing productivity of humanity is, as before, our mandate to manifest the absolute. In the Einführung, poetry, philosophy, and mythology are bound up together and convey each other. And in a complex manner, myth stands both as an illustration of negative philosophy, as well as holding within itself the possibility of positive philosophy. As art is an aspect of this movement of consciousness, it is itself told in the mythological process. As such, it is possible to extricate a new theory of artistic production from the God-positing nature of humanity, yet it must be done with care, lest it find itself merely relating negative philosophy and seeking to reduce being to thought, attempting to win, as Schelling writes, objectivity for the mythological representations. Schelling's own comments in relation to art and artistic production are underdeveloped and ambiguous, but there is enough to work with. Positively, he states that mythology again forms the indispensable basis for art and is the subject of artistic and literary depictions. It precedes all art and literature, inventing and generating the material too, be it as it would call for, giving rise to all subsequent free productions. Negatively, Schelling sees the situation of the world is such that true mythological artistic production is nigh impossible due to the despair and skepticism of the world of its contemporary situation. And in his exploration of ontology, tautology, and poetry in the Einführung, Schelling leaves us somewhat high and dry. There is the possibility of positive philosophy, but the reality of negative philosophy reflected just as much in art as it is in mythology. Unlike the God which is to come, art appears unable to. However, taking this mythology, ontology, and our God-positing nature, the case can be made that Schelling's later thought leaves us with the potential for a new philosophy of art. So Schelling's comments on mythology in his Spirit philosophy point towards the possibility of positive productivity in art. Even if the effects may often be negative, the ontological mandates towards productivity remain in Schelling's philosophy. In that case, if there is to be a positive productivity in art, according to the new ontological and tautogorical framework, it will be the production of something which gestures towards that which is ever coming. And it's here that we can engage with his earlier comments about productivity and creativity. Schelling maintains that the productivity of human nature, he maintains it, but he shifts it instead to kind of God-positing instead. And this God-positing works itself out in mythology. And due to the earlier connection between mythology, productivity, and the novel, there's a case can be made that that art form may contain certain possibilities that he denies to poetry. Indeed, considering Schelling's earlier account of the novel, it is the case that the novel is the literary art that best coheres with Schelling's late philosophy. The novel, even in his own writing about it, accepts the despair and the brokenness of the world and is able, even in those situations, to present from that a totality, one which is able to express the tragedy of existence whilst emulating the universality and the hope of the epic. In constructing a world, the novel relates to it and explores it. It relates the world relating to the world and also explores it. Through its own mythological inspiration, it can be classified as theogonic. The novel can express mythology, and in doing so, it can be understood as tautogorical. So the novel is able to communicate the history and reality of our situation, as well as pointing towards the God who comes, and may be better suited to fulfill that artistic mandate to create a mythology in a world that cannot sustain it. As mythology, as tautogorical, the novel can point towards a third potence in its ability to communicate a world non-rationally. The ontology and tautogony of this particular work of art therefore leads to a new way of conceiving truth in fiction, as representative of the world whilst pointing towards another. And so it's possible to construct from Schelling's Spirit philosophy this new understanding of truth of the novel as tautogorical. This understanding rests both on the possibilities of the novel as formulated in the Philosophie der Kunst, alongside the metaphysical grounding of tautology and mythology in the Einführung. The novel has a unique position in being able to knit together and present a world in a situation where totality is no longer a given. Furthermore, this approach raises further questions concerning mythology, nationhood, and cultural coherence that demand exploration and certainly impact upon philosophy of culture and ethics. And finally, it engages with a pertinent question due to recent engagement with the use and usefulness of literature. And so the development of this philosophical position can combat a view of literature as instrumental, I think, either as a statement for the reader or didactic, as educative rather than reflective or immersive. Viewing literature as mythology, with that particular conceptual and ontological status, will, I think, ground a new way of understanding reading us as an openness. It can allow for a way of understanding art and artistic production that is neither art for art's sake nor didactic, instead opening up different experience of reality through its mythological character. The creation of literature and the experience of reading literature can open up, it becomes a creative act fundamentally, in which one person is able to create a narrative. And in that, the reader is able to inhabit that creative narrative without ever kind of owning it or fully understanding or grasping it or limiting it. It allows for a kind of collaborative, engaged reality in which others can participate. And so this act of creative and participative points towards new ways, I think, of relating the questions of truth and the possibilities of knowing and inhabiting reality in relation to literature and art. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. So we have a good bit of time for questions and comments and discussion. So I think we have a good 20 minutes or so if we'd like for discussion. Yeah, Jesper, please.
Yeah. Thanks for your talk. It interested me very much, and it posed a similar question to the one I posed at the end of my talk. And I have more questions, open questions. One question is such, you talked about this new mythology in the novel, that in novels you can find constructed new mythologies, right? That you can construct them or show them, or such new mythologies, or a new mythology, or whatever. So, but my question, and I posed this question at the end of my talk too, is such a form of communication possible? I'm asking as a Dane and as the vice president of the Kierkegaard Society, because this would be a form of direct communication, right? As much as I like Schelling, I'm always baffled. What is this kind of communication, and is it possible in an age of reason? Because my thesis was that this new mythology is a kind of scientific, rational, or mythology of reason, some kind. So in an age of reason, which is also an age of critique and difference, of course we would, I think this is the early Schelling's claim, we strive towards such a new mythology. But what is such a form of communication viable in our days and age? And I remind of, I think of Kierkegaard in his Lily, which is, I don't know the English title, Lily on the Field and the Bird under the Sky, Lilien på Marken, right? Where he says, okay, we can give such myths, right? He tells these stories. There's this bird that wants to go to another place, right? No, there's this lily that wants to go to another place because the grass is always greener on the other side. So it goes there and it dies on the way, right? And he says, well, yeah, such stories, maybe fools like Hans Christian Andersen could tell such stories, right? But this is just Stimmung, right? In the bad sense of the word. We're trying to get away from the real problems, from the phenomena. So he calls this is actually just Weltflucht. This is just trying to escape from the world. And I think what Schelling, at least the early Schelling one, and maybe also the later one, and we touched upon this question, that myth has to do with reality, Wirklichkeit. So how do you see this balance between myth and Kierkegaard, myth and Schelling, and the question of reality? Is it viable, doable?
I think in some ways, I don't think myths have ever gone away, though. I think there's lots of ways in which things that we take as rational worldviews are actually their own mythologies, and they're their own. So I think in some way we're not aware of how much of our worldview is still mythological. And I guess in some ways my vague hope is that if we have the ability to talk about the way in which our reality continues to still be mythological, there can be ways in which we look at art as being able to depict those mythologies. And that leads to a different question, I think. That just becomes reflection rather than actual creativity. And I think that there still remains the issue of like who is able to create myths, because I mean Schelling was extremely restrictive in who was able to create mythological novels. He said in his time there were two novels which counted as like that, having that status. It was Don Juan, Cervantes' Don Juan, and Goethe's I think it was the Leiden of young Werther. I think it was that one. I think it was that rather than Wilhelm Meister. I think so. Anyway, I have to check that again. Yeah, it was extremely restrictive. So I would say I would like to think it is possible, because I think in some way it should be going back to that kind of Kierkegaardian thing, a way of showing up the truth and showing, being able to hold a mirror to the world and show the kind of, be a way of breaking the kind of myths that we construct and the myths that we live in as well, but also have the possibility for understanding what a great work of art could be. So it's like half idealism, half like social critique, I suppose. If you want to come back, let me know. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. There are other questions, I see. Thanks, it's great. It's a really interesting topic. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Stefan, you're up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk. The who question, who is able to create, and I mean really capable of creating myths or mythology, I find very, very interesting and difficult, because especially when you think of the novel, and the novel is really the kind of art form that has an author by definition. However, mythology does not have an author. If we follow, for instance, Claude Lévi-Strauss, really, he's very clear on that. He says mythology is that form of storytelling that does not have an author, that defines it. The novel is defined by having an author. You say the novel can express mythology. So the question is, of course, does it then create new mythology, or does it process mythologies as a sujet, as a subject matter that is then in variation and in very new ways and new transformations presented and worked through with Blumenberg? Or isn't there a deeper contradiction? And I believe, if I may add this, I believe that Lukács, in a way, or that Lukács' theory consciously or unconsciously marks that point, this breach, if you will, between the epic or whatever it is that he's busy with, and then the novel and the dramatic modernity of it. That there is really something like a shift that also marks a point of no return. So where mythology as mythology is no longer really attainable or so. I hope it makes sense, the question. It's a lot of different things.
No, it does make sense. Yeah, because it's fundamental. Like, what does it mean to create a myth, actually? Because I think, strictly speaking, in Schelling, and obviously people can correct me, we don't create something new, but we create something unrealizable in a way. And so one of the things that when I kind of want to expand this a bit more for the collection, Mikhail Bakhtin's understanding of the novel as kind of unrealizable could be a way of, it could be a way of giving an ontological grounding, or a kind of a grounding towards that understanding of the novel. So I think it's more that, and in some ways that's why it's interesting to use Schelling for this, because even though you are creating out of what is already there, what is already there is also not just there. There's also this kind of like this unrealizability, this potentiality behind it. So I think it gives you some kind of freedom, albeit a freedom that is dependent on accepting Schelling's late philosophy, which, you know, not everybody does, I suppose, and it might be a bit of a hard ask in some cases. Yeah. When I first wrote this paper, I actually was looking at it with regards to a particular novel, Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, because that is a way of deliberately rewriting a mythology as a statement about a particular historical situation in the world. And in some ways that it could be a way of understanding his novel as both a modern novel and not quite a modern novel as well. So when he was writing this novel, he was trying to do something a bit more James Joycean, for example, but you know, you can't get a German to leave their structure, I suppose. So I think, so I think that is a huge question, but then it also ties into what do we understand by reality as well. I hope that helps. Maybe it doesn't.
Thank you.
We have a few more questions. Thanks a lot. This is a very nice discussion. Sakura, I think we can go ahead next. And then Jesper again.
Okay. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. And so I'd like to ask you another genre of art, for example, the plastic art. So it is both of the lines are real and ideal. lines or the genre of art is very important for Schelling and in the lecture philosophy of art too. And so how do you think about the possibility of new mythology? So to create a new mythology by only by the literary art. So, and why I ask this question, because in the modern period, so in his contemporary time, so modern novel is very active, I think so. And but from another perspective, so plastic art, for example, landscape or something is also positive or actively produced. So how do you think about in the other lines of art? So the other line, for example, plastic art can produce a new mythology or not?
I think, strictly speaking, it is just literary arts which have this ability. It's it's kind of like if you look at the way in which the novel is described, particularly in Schelling, it echoes bits and pieces of what Hegel says about the novel, because in some ways there's certain forms of writing which are no longer possible to us. Both Hegel and Schelling don't think you can ever do an epic again, for example. We're kind of left with a novel as a kind of development of tragedy, which combines bits and pieces of the ethic. And there's that shift from the finite to the infinite, from the particular to the universal, that is particularly possible through the literary arts in the way that it's not possible through the plastic arts, through other kinds of arts. What they could do, I think, if you take his new thoughts, is that once that new mythology has been produced or told, then the plastic arts could mirror that. But I don't think they themselves have that creative tendency, because it has to be about the individual working within these two genres and what they and the way in which they present the individual subject to a more universal idea. I think that's my best guess. Anyway, it was a good question. Thanks.
Okay, so maybe we have time for one more question. Back to Jesper again, and then you can have the final question, and Deborah, you can have the final word.
Okay, no, this is actually just a comment with regards to the author of novels. I think maybe that has changed, right? And I'm thinking of Kierkegaard again, writing in pseudonyms the entire times. And also, I wasn't thinking about Kierkegaard at the beginning. I was thinking about E.T.A. Hoffmann, Lebensansichten des Katers Moors, right? Autobiography of a cat, right? Where the pages are mixed with the pages of I don't know the English term, Kapellmeister, right? And the cat is actually the author. One is writing to write about autobiography, but it mixed pages with another autobiography, and the press got mixed up. So you have the author is not really a question, and I think that I would count that as a novel. I don't know. So this will comment. My next question, my question was this: that myths mirrors things. That myths mirror things. This would be a mimesis reading, right? Of myths, and I'm not sure that would agree with what Schelling has in mind. Wouldn't that come very close to an allegorical meaning? I know that it's a problem in Schelling as well, as I see it, but what is your thought on that?
I think in some ways he'd say that bad novelists mirror, whereas the true geniuses can actually go beyond that. So it becomes a kind of art, a kind of literary criticism, doesn't it, in a way? Regarding the point about go on.
No, sorry.
Yeah, and I think about the E.T.A. Hoffmann thing. I mean, yeah, even when there is indirect communication going on, there is still somebody writing it, isn't there? It's still the product of like someone's creativity. I suppose you'd need to go for like. I suppose the question then was like, what do co-written novels? What would a co-written novel be? Or again, would you just make the standard for what a novel is so stringent that only certain things get to fulfill it?
Symphilosophie.
Yeah.
Okay, this has been a really interesting discussion. I've been very impressed by all the talks and all the questions and the discussion so far. I think it's a good time for us to take a break. We have about 35 minutes for a break, and we're going to transition from the kind of Schellingian orientation of the first session. We've been very happy to talk Schelling for 3 hours. It's not something I get to do all the time, to talking Japanese philosophy for 3 hours. So if you'd like to learn a bit about Japanese philosophy and its connection to myth, then I'll see you after your lunch and or dinner. So I think we come back at 8 o'clock. Yeah, Hong Kong time. All right, thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks. See you soon.